Section 1. The yellow skin nobody questions. There is something wrong with the people of Springfield. Not wrong in the way that television characters are sometimes wrong, flawed in charming ways, struggling with relatable problems, making mistakes that resolve themselves by the end of the episode. Wrong in a different way. Wrong in a way that the show has been showing you for 36 years, embedding the evidence in every single frame, in the color of every face, in the shape of every hand, in the logic of a town that should not be able to function the way it does, and yet keeps functioning regardless. Let's start with the color. Every person in Springfield is yellow. Not pale, not olive, not any shade that exists in the natural spectrum of human skin tone. Yellow, a specific, saturated, almost luminescent yellow that covers every resident from the mayor to the school janitor, from the oldest citizen to the newest baby. They are all yellow. They have all always been yellow. And for 36 years, viewers have accepted this without question because the explanation has always been right there waiting. It's just the art style. It's how the show looks. Matt Groening drew them yellow, and that's the end of it. Except that explanation stops working the moment you look at who isn't yellow. Guest characters who visit Springfield from the outside world look different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes sit in their heads at angles that more closely approximate real human anatomy. Their features have a kind of dimensional quality that the Springfield residents lack. They look, in the most precise possible sense, more like people. And this difference is consistent. It appears episode after episode, decade after decade. The people who live inside Springfield look one way. The people who come from outside look another way entirely. The show has always framed this as an artistic choice. Outsiders are drawn more realistically to contrast with the show's signature style. It creates a visual shorthand for telling the audience who belongs to this world and who is a visitor. That explanation is clean. It's satisfying. It closes the question before it can open any further. But there is another explanation, one that lives inside the show's own logic rather than outside it, and once you hear it, the yellow skin stops being an artistic choice and starts being a symptom. The Springfield nuclear power plant has been leaking radiation into the town's water supply, air, and soil since before the show began. This is not speculation. This is stated, demonstrated, and confirmed across dozens of episodes. The plant has been cited for 342 separate safety violations. Not minor procedural failures, not paperwork oversights. Violations of the kind that, in any functioning regulatory environment, would have resulted in the immediate shutdown of the facility and the evacuation of the surrounding population. Radioactive waste dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste left on children's playgrounds. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats living freely in the facility's lower levels. Plutonium used as a paperweight on someone's desk. These are not background details. The show presents them directly, lingers on them, and then moves on as if none of it matters. And the safety inspector responsible for catching all of this, the person whose literal job description is to stand between the plant's catastrophic failures and the people living downwind, is Homer Simpson. A man the show's own creator has confirmed has an IQ of 55. A man who sleeps at his workstation. A man who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen to it. This is the person standing between Springfield and radioactive contamination. He has been standing there for over 3 decades, failing at that job, and the plant has been leaking the entire time. The first visible evidence of what this leaking radiation is doing to living organisms appears in Season 2 in a fish named Blinky. Blinky is pulled from a river near the power plant. He has 3 eyes, not 2 eyes, the way fish are supposed to have. 3. The mutation is undeniable. The episode treats it as a scandal. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as a centerpiece of his campaign, holding the fish up as proof that Charles Montgomery Burns is poisoning the environment. The story makes national news within the show's universe. Burns is cornered, humiliated, forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it's harmless. And then the town moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts a study. Nobody asks the obvious question that is hanging in the air like smoke. If the fish downstream from the plant have grown an extra eye, what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The answer, if you're willing to follow the logic all the way to its conclusion, is that it's happening to them too. It's been happening to them for years. It happened to their parents and will happen to their children. The radiation doesn't stop at the riverbank. It doesn't stop because it reaches a person instead of a fish. It moves through the water table, through the food supply, through the air that settles over a town built in the shadow of a cracked cooling tower. And the people of Springfield drink that water, breathe that air, eat the food that grows in that soil, and they do it every day, across every season, across every decade, and they never stop to ask why their fish have 3 eyes. Now look at the hands. Every character in Springfield has 4 fingers. This fact is so normalized, so completely absorbed into the visual grammar of the show, that most viewers never consciously register it. Of course they have 4 fingers, the reasoning goes. Cartoon characters have 4 fingers. It's easier to draw. It's a stylistic convention that goes back to the earliest days of animation. There's nothing to see here, except that human beings have 5 fingers. And the question of why Springfield's residents have 4 of them has a biological answer that sits right alongside the radiation theory without any contradiction. Radiation exposure, particularly chronic low-level exposure over extended periods, is one of the documented causes of limb abnormalities in developing organisms. The literature on populations living near nuclear facilities includes studies of increased rates of developmental irregularities. The kind of irregularities that, in a family living downwind of a leaking reactor for multiple generations, could manifest exactly as the show depicts. 4 fingers, unusual skull proportions, overbites, eyes that protrude at angles inconsistent with human orbital anatomy, skin that is yellow in a way no human skin is yellow, hair that maintains impossible shapes without product or effort, a physical template that deviates from normal human biology in consistent, repeatable ways across an entire population, and all of it concentrated in one town, all of it affecting people who live within the contamination radius of the same nuclear facility. All of it absent in visitors who arrive from outside. Homer's body tells this story more vividly than anyone else's. He has survived things that would kill any normally functioning human being. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen from cliffs and been hit by cars and been caught in explosions and walked away from every single one of them. His healing rate is extraordinary. His pain tolerance operates at a level that does not exist in baseline human biology. He absorbs physical trauma the way healthy tissue absorbs minor bruising. This is usually explained as cartoon logic. Homer survives because the show needs him to survive. He bounces back because he's the main character, and main characters don't die from falling down a cliff. That explanation works perfectly well on the surface, but the radiation theory offers something underneath the surface, a biological mechanism that turns Homer's impossible durability from a narrative convenience into a consequence. Decades of radiation exposure, beginning in childhood, progressing through his years of direct proximity to an active reactor core, have altered his physiology at the cellular level. His body does not respond to damage the way a normal body responds because his body is not, in any meaningful biological sense, normal anymore. And Marge carries her own evidence. The hair is the detail that the radiation theory keeps returning to, and with good reason. Marge Simpson's hair grows straight up. It has always grown straight up. It reaches a height that physics and biology agree is not achievable through normal human hair growth patterns. It maintains its shape without product, without structural support, without any visible mechanism of support whatsoever. It is simply there, defying gravity, defying biology, as permanent and immutable as the cooling towers that loom over their neighborhood. The show has never explained Marge's hair. It has occasionally acknowledged the hair as unusual, made jokes about it, let other characters react to it with mild surprise. But it has never explained what physiological mechanism allows a human head to produce hair that behaves the way Marge's hair behaves. The radiation theory has an explanation. Radiation at sufficient concentrations over sufficient time produces mutations. Mutations can affect protein structure in hair follicles. The right mutation, expressed across years of exposure beginning in early childhood, could theoretically produce hair that grows in ways inconsistent with normal human hair growth. It's not a joke. It's a symptom wearing a joke's clothing. Bart's spikes follow the same logic. Lisa's perfectly maintained shape. Maggie's tidy bow. Every member of the family displays hair behavior that cannot be explained by normal biology. And they all live in the same house, drink the same water, breathe the same air, and attend, at least in Homer's case, the same nuclear facility that the show has documented pumping radiation into their environment for 3 decades. The animals confirm it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same wide, protruding eyes as his owners. His proportions deviate from real canine anatomy in the same ways that the human characters deviate from real human anatomy. He looks like a dog who has been living in Springfield, because he has been living in Springfield. Because whatever the radiation is doing to the people is doing the same thing to their pets. And Blinky the fish sits at the beginning of all of this, patient and three-eyed in his river, visible proof that the contamination is real and that the show has been showing it to you since the second season. The Simpsons movie made the contamination impossible to ignore. Springfield's environmental disaster reaches a point so catastrophic in that film that the Environmental Protection Agency, operating as a real federal institution within the show's universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading. The United States government, looking at Springfield, reaches the conclusion that the entire town is too toxic, too fundamentally contaminated to be allowed contact with the rest of the country. The solution is not cleanup. The solution is not remediation. The solution is containment, a dome, walls of glass trapping every resident inside the contamination zone, while the federal government decides what to do with a town that has become an environmental hazard on a national scale. And every person in Springfield is still inside when the dome goes up. They're still drinking the water, still breathing the air, still living in the shadow of the same cracked cooling towers, still carrying the same mutations in their bodies, still unable to connect the yellow skin and the four fingers and the impossible hair and the three-eyed fish to the thing that sits at the center of all of it, the thing that has always sat at the center of all of it. Burns knows. He has always known. The show makes this explicit, quietly, across episodes that seem unrelated until you start looking at them together. Burns has private physicians. He has a personal pharmaceutical infrastructure. He undergoes weekly medical treatments so extreme that they cause his body to emit visible light. The treatments keep him alive for exactly one more week, and then he needs another dose, and the cycle repeats. And it has been repeating for longer than most of the town's residents have been alive. Burns is not just profiting from radiation. He is personally dependent on it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by his decades of proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain itself through normal biological processes. He requires controlled radiation exposure the way a normal human requires food and water. And because he requires it, because he has spent a century managing its effects on his own biology, he understands exactly what radiation does to living systems. He knows what his plant is doing to Springfield. He knows it because his own body is a more extreme version of the same process. Springfield is his laboratory and his residents are his experimental population, and the experiment has been running for over 30 years without a control group or an ethics board or a single person brave enough to file a complaint that Burns cannot make disappear. The crayon completes the picture. In season 12, the show reveals that Homer has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood. When it's removed, his IQ climbs to genius level. He becomes articulate, analytical, capable of understanding the world around him with a clarity that his ordinary self cannot access. He sees Springfield for what it really is. He sees his job. He sees the plant. He sees the architecture of his own suffering laid out in front of him with perfect, terrible clarity, and it makes him miserable. So he puts the crayon back. He chooses stupidity. He chooses the fog. The show presents this as a sad, funny, touching moment of self-awareness. Homer knows he's smarter without the crayon, and he chooses the crayon anyway, because being smart in Springfield is its own kind of prison. But the radiation theory adds a layer underneath that reading, because the question the show never asks is how a crayon ended up in a child's brain without any doctor catching it. How Homer went through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life, visiting Springfield's medical professionals for checkups and consultations and presumably the occasional physical, and not a single one of them found a foreign object lodged in his skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any reasonable threshold, or someone knew about the crayon and chose not to remove it. And if the medical establishment in Springfield is compromised, if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of the town he essentially owns, then Homer's crayon starts to look less like an accident and more like a decision. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that keeps them compliant, incurious, unable to look up at those cooling towers and ask the simplest question a person can ask. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about the Simpsons. It explains all of them. The yellow skin, the four fingers, the impossible hair, the physical resilience, the cognitive impairment, the three-eyed fish, the glowing billionaire, the dome, the crayon, the town that resets after every catastrophe and never remembers the last one. The population that watches disaster after disaster unfold in their community and accepts each one with the patient, bovine calm of people whose critical thinking capacity has been quietly, systematically, invisibly eroded over decades of low-level exposure to the same poison their water supply has been carrying since before most of them were born. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. Springfield is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric. They are symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, that provides their electricity, that employs their neighbors and poisons their water and irradiates their children, is not a background gag. It is the cause. It has always been the cause. Every yellow face and every impossible healing and every forgotten catastrophe and every reset traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible poison into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged brains that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have 4 fingers. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not just part of the show, it is the show. And nobody in Springfield will ever figure that out, because the plant already made sure they cannot. If you are still awake, drop a comment with your time and location. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people all over the world are settling in with the same story at the same moment. And if you want more of these, subscribe. There is a lot more to get through tonight. Section 2. The man who poisoned a town and called it business. Charles Montgomery Burns was born somewhere in the late 1800s. The show is deliberately imprecise about the exact year. Different episodes suggest different dates. The most conservative reading of his various historical references places his birth somewhere around 1880. The most generous reading pushes it further back than that. But by any calculation, by any version of the timeline, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most likely accounting, he is closer to 140. And he is not simply alive in the way that very old people are alive, diminished and fragile, and counting out their days in careful increments. He is alive in the way that a machine is alive when it has been properly maintained. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal politics. He orchestrates schemes that require sustained cognitive effort, long-term planning, and a working knowledge of modern technology, modern finance, and modern law. His mind is sharp in ways that most people half his age would envy. His body is frail, yes. His physical strength is almost non-existent. But his intelligence, his cunning, his capacity for strategic cruelty, all of that operates at a level that nobody in Springfield can match. He has been operating at that level for longer than anyone alive has been alive. This is the first mystery of Charles Montgomery Burns, and it sits right at the surface where anyone can see it, dressed up in jokes and passed off as cartoon absurdity. He is too old. He has been too old for the entire run of the show. And the question of how he has stayed alive this long, and what it has cost him, and what it has cost everyone around him, is one of the most carefully constructed threads in the show's entire 36-year history. Let's start with the treatments. In the episode called The Springfield Files, Homer sees something glowing in the woods near town. He becomes convinced it's an alien. The entire community erupts into low-grade hysteria. The FBI sends agents Mulder and Scully to investigate. The episode builds toward a dramatic reveal, and when the truth finally comes out, the glowing figure in the woods is not an alien. It is Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with experimental compounds and controlled radiation therapy, that it causes his entire body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he dies. The margin for error is 0. The show presents this as the punchline to a X-Files parody. The joke is that the alien was just the weird old man from the power plant glowing from his medicine. That joke does its job. Audiences laugh. The episode ends. And then the implications sit there in the dark for anyone willing to pick them up. Burns requires medical intervention every 7 days to remain alive. Not treatment for an illness, not management of a condition that could theoretically resolve itself, but a perpetual, non-negotiable cycle of intervention that has no endpoint and no possibility of weaning. Miss one treatment and Burns dies. The system has no tolerance for disruption. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine, through scheduled servicing, precise inputs, zero deviation from protocol. And the treatment involves radiation. This detail is the one that connects everything. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been pumping radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. He is not just profiting from nuclear energy, he is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material that normal cellular processes can no longer maintain him. He requires external radiation input the way a normal person requires food. The nuclear plant is not just his business, it is his life support system, operating at a municipal scale, with an entire town paying the cost of keeping it running. This explains the disease situation, which is perhaps the most famous piece of Burns lore in the entire series. A doctor informs Burns that he has every disease known to medical science, every single one. Not sequentially, not in rotation, but simultaneously, all at once, every known pathogen and syndrome and malignancy present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains that this state of total disease saturation has produced a biological paradox. Every illness in Burns's body is trying to kill him at the same moment, which means each illness is being blocked by every other illness. None of them can gain dominance. None of them can progress to the point of being fatal, because every pathway toward fatality is occupied by a competing disease trying to use the same pathway. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome, 3 people trying to get through a doorway at once. None of them can get through. Burns is, by this diagnosis, the sickest human being in America. His body is a catastrophic accumulation of every pathology that medicine has ever cataloged, and he is functionally indestructible because every possible cause of death is canceling out every other possible cause of death in a perfect, terrible equilibrium. The show plays this for laughs. It is genuinely funny. And it is also, under the framework of what we know about his treatments and his radiation dependency, a precise description of a body that has been maintained through chemical and radiological intervention for so long that its normal biological processes have been overridden entirely. Burns's diseases are in equilibrium not because of some cosmic coincidence. The weekly treatments are maintaining that equilibrium. They are the control rods in the human reactor. They keep every illness in perfect stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining dominance and triggering a cascade that the system cannot contain. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly appointments are the equivalent of adjusting the fuel rods to prevent meltdown. Now consider what this means for Smithers. Waylon Smithers is Burns's personal assistant, and the relationship between them has been analyzed and debated across decades of fan commentary. The devotion Smithers displays toward Burns has been read as comic exaggeration, as unrequited romantic feeling, as the loyalty of a man who has no life outside his employer. All of these readings are present in the show, and all of them contain truth. But there is another reading underneath all of them, one that the radiation theory illuminates with uncomfortable clarity. Smithers is the only person in Springfield who fully understands how Burns's medical protocol works. He manages Burns's schedule. He ensures that every weekly appointment happens on time, with no disruption, with no deviation from the established routine. He monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that borders on obsession, noting changes in his color and his energy and his responsiveness, with the attention of someone who understands exactly what those changes might signal. He is not simply a loyal employee. He is, in the most literal functional sense, Burns's medical infrastructure. He is the person who keeps the reactor running. He is the reason the treatments happen on schedule. And he knows what happens if the treatments don't happen. The show has depicted this multiple times. When Smithers takes a vacation, Burns deteriorates. When Smithers is absent for any extended period, Burns becomes helpless in ways that go beyond the merely social. His body begins to fail. The equilibrium that the treatments maintain starts to shift. The system shows signs of stress. Smithers is not devoted to Burns merely out of emotional attachment. He is devoted because he knows, with absolute clarity, that his absence is a death sentence. His loyalty is not a personality trait, it is a survival arrangement. Burns survives because Smithers keeps the schedule, and Smithers keeps the schedule because he knows that he is the only thing standing between Burns and the simultaneous activation of every disease in his body. That is the foundation of their relationship. Not love, not hierarchy, a biological dependency dressed in the clothing of professional devotion. Burns's connection to historical events adds a different layer to the immortality question, one that the show has built gradually across its run without ever calling attention to it directly. The list of historical moments Burns references as personal experience is extraordinary. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, in a capacity the show describes as morally questionable. During the war, he somehow came into possession of a $1 trillion bill that the United States government had printed for use in foreign aid, and he kept it hidden for decades. He has described the Gilded Age not as a historical period, but as lived experience. He has referenced the Spanish-American War in casual conversation, the way a person references something they remember. He knew Howard Hughes. He has described relationships with historical figures who died before the oldest living person in Springfield was born. The show uses these references for comic effect, running jokes about Burns's extreme age and his increasingly bewildering disconnection from contemporary life. But taken together, they sketch a portrait of a man whose historical reach extends across at least 140 years of American history, touching moments and figures that span from the Industrial Revolution through the present day. This is not simply old age. This is something that shouldn't be possible, maintained through something that should not exist, in service of something that has never been fully explained. The Burns family history deepens the mystery further. The show has depicted the Burns dynasty as one of the oldest and most consistently powerful lineages in American history. Not simply wealthy, but the kind of wealthy that shapes institutions, that builds infrastructure and then charges everyone else for access to it, that exists so far above the mechanisms of legal accountability that accountability becomes theoretical rather than practical. The current Burns inherited this legacy. He did not build it from nothing. He took control of something that was already ancient when he assumed stewardship of it, and he has been extending it for well over a century, which raises a question the show has never directly answered. Is Burns unique, or has the Burns family always found ways to extend their hold on power beyond normal human lifespans? Before nuclear radiation? Before the specific medical technology that currently keeps Burns alive? Before any of the modern interventions that he currently depends on? Did the Burns family employ other methods? Did previous generations of the dynasty use other mechanisms to maintain their continuity? Other forms of biological manipulation? Other technologies of self-preservation that predated the nuclear age? The show does not say, but it does establish that the Burns family has been in continuous, effective control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not happen through normal generational succession, through inheritance and estate planning, and the ordinary mechanisms by which wealth passes between generations. It requires either extraordinary luck sustained across multiple centuries, or extraordinary measures that the show has never needed to name, because naming them would require acknowledging that the Burns family has been doing something inhuman for a very long time. What the show has established is that Burns's relationship with death is unlike any other character's relationship with death. He has come close to dying more often than almost anyone else in Springfield. He has been shot, hospitalized dozens of times, collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been abandoned in the wilderness without food or shelter or any of the resources he normally depends on. He has been brought to the edge of death repeatedly across the show's run, and every time he returns, not through cartoon resilience, not through the kind of casual supernatural durability that the show grants Homer. Burns returns through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of accumulated wealth that ensures no matter what happens to his physical form, there is always someone standing by with the resources and the knowledge to rebuild him. Homer survives because the show needs him to survive. The show's narrative requires him to be present next week. Burns survives because he has spent a century constructing a system whose entire purpose is his survival. The survival is not incidental. It is engineered. Every dollar spent, every institution influenced, every doctor retained, every politician purchased, it all serves the same single function. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases in equilibrium. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the empire dies with him. And empires do not allow themselves to die if they have any mechanism of preventing it. The biological weapons laboratory is the piece of Burns's history that the show drops into the narrative and then steps back from, never fully engaging with what it means. In the episode about Homer's mother, it's revealed that Burns did not only own a nuclear power plant, he owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory in Springfield designed to produce biological weapons, manufacturing weapon-grade pathogens in the same community where families were raising children, where Homer Simpson was growing up, where people were going to work and buying groceries and living their lives without any knowledge that the richest man in town was cooking up diseases in a building down the road. This was not a foreign operation. This was not a distant facility in some anonymous industrial corridor. This was Springfield. This was the town where Burns lived, where his employees lived, where their families lived, and he was manufacturing biological weapons there. The scale of what this implies about Burns's moral architecture is staggering if you sit with it long enough. This is a man who built a weapons laboratory in his own community, who exposed his own workforce and their families to the risk of a catastrophic biological incident in service of whatever financial arrangement the weapons represented, who, when the lab was destroyed by activists, did not respond with any form of self-reflection or accountability. He responded by identifying one of the activists and pursuing her across 27 years, using federal law enforcement as a personal instrument of revenge, destroying her family's life because she had the temerity to damage one of his facilities. That is Burns. Not the joke version, not the cartoon villain version, but the version the show has been constructing in the background of its comedy for 3 decades. A man whose relationship to human life is purely transactional, who views the community around him as a resource to be managed rather than people to be protected, who has been conducting a long-running experiment on Springfield's population with the full knowledge of what his plant is doing to them and the complete absence of any intention to stop. He does not stop because stopping would require acknowledging what he has already done. And acknowledging what he has already done would require answering questions that no amount of legal infrastructure could protect him from. The plant has been leaking for decades. The biological weapons lab existed in a residential area. The safety violations have been documented in numbers that make accidental negligence an implausible explanation. The pattern is not carelessness. The pattern is a decision. Burns decided that Springfield was worth poisoning if Springfield's electricity could make him money. He decided that Springfield's population was a manageable variable rather than an ethical constraint. He decided that Homer Simpson's continued employment, despite 3 documented crayon-related brain incidents and hundreds of safety failures, was strategically preferable to hiring someone competent who might notice the extent of the violations and report them to a regulatory body that Burns had not yet managed to compromise. He decided all of this, and then he lived with it for over a century, maintaining his disease equilibrium through weekly treatments in his private medical facility, watching his town slowly mutate around him, glowing faintly in the dark as he walked through the woods after each session, alien green and ancient and entirely untroubled by what he was. That is not cartoon villainy. That is something else. Something that the show has been building toward for 36 years without ever quite arriving, because arriving would require the show to become something other than a comedy, and the show cannot stop being a comedy. The comedy is its camouflage. The comedy is how it has survived long enough to tell this story in plain sight without anyone taking it seriously. Burns is the show's darkest truth wearing a monocle and a bathrobe. And Springfield keeps the lights on for him because Springfield has no other choice. The power plant is the town's only major employer. Its economic influence extends through the entire community. The people who work there, the businesses that serve those workers, the municipal budget that depends on the taxes the plant generates, all of it connects back to Burns, and to the treatments that keep Burns alive, and to the radiation that keeps the treatments necessary, and to the leaking coolant that keeps the radiation spreading, and to the yellow skin, and the 4 fingers, and the 3-eyed fish that have been telling you, what Springfield really is since the second season of a show that has been running for 36 years. Springfield cannot challenge Burns because challenging Burns means the economy collapses. The economy collapsing means the town dies, so the town keeps its eyes down. And Burns keeps the reactor running, and everyone inside the contamination zone keeps being exactly what the contamination has made them: damaged enough to work, compliant enough to stay, and not quite smart enough, not quite functional enough, not quite free enough to ask the one question that would end everything. Why are we all like this? The answer is standing at the top of the hill. Has always been standing at the top of the hill, ancient and glowing, and entirely aware of what it has done. Looking out over a yellow town with three-eyed fish in its rivers and a safety inspector with a crayon in his skull, and a population that votes on Sundays and forgets by Monday what it voted about? Burns does not need to suppress the truth actively. Springfield's radiation has already done that for him. Section 3. Homer's Brain. A crayon, a coma, and a closed door. On April 1st, 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. Its title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was straightforward. Bart plays a series of April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one escalating in scale and ambition, until he takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the explosion sends him to the hospital. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed, he sees a vending machine across the room. He reaches for it. It tips over and crushes him. Homer flatlines and enters a coma. The episode ends with Homer waking up. Bart confesses tearfully at his bedside, and Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son, and the family laughs, and everything goes back to normal. The show tells you he woke up. The story moves on. But the final moments of that same episode include a piece of information that the show drops almost as an afterthought. During his time unconscious, Homer lost 5% of his brain function. 5%. Gone, permanently, destroyed. And Homer's response to being told that he has sustained irreversible neurological damage is to laugh, even though he explains to the room that he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends, and The Simpsons continued for 32 more years as if nothing had happened, unless nothing did happen, unless Homer never woke up at all. This is the Homer coma theory, and it is the most popular, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the history of the show. The basic premise, originally proposed online under the handle Hard Topic A Name, is simple. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline and character development and guest appearance and impossible event is a dream being generated by the comatose mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. The evidence is genuinely difficult to dismiss once you start looking at it. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in a documentary sense, it was always a cartoon and always embraced the liberties that cartoons afford, but the storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers whether she is happy in her marriage. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and discovers that intellectual connection can feel like more than it is. Bart struggles with his grades and faces the real possibility of being held back a year. These are everyday family problems told through satire, but they are rooted in the kind of situations that real families navigate: financial stress, marital tension, academic failure, parent-child conflict. The emotional core of the early show was built on the familiar struggles of an ordinary American family trying to hold itself together. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not subtle. It is tectonic. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for 27 years. Homer meets God twice, in full conversation, in episodes that are treated as canonical rather than fantastical. The show moves from family sitcom rooted in economic anxiety to something else entirely, something where the main character has met multiple presidents, traveled to dozens of countries, held hundreds of different jobs. befriended celebrities at a rate that would make even the most socially connected person seem isolated by comparison, and survived physical trauma that would kill not one person but a collection of people. The escalation is so dramatic that even casual fans have noticed the tonal shift. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons declined in quality for 20 years. The coma theory proposes that the answer is not about quality at all. The Simpsons did not get worse. Homer's brain got worse, and what looks like declining writing is actually the faithful simulation of a mind that is deteriorating in real time, generating increasingly unmoored dream logic as the underlying neural tissue erodes. And here is the detail that makes the theory stay with you long after you encounter it. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a conversation with God. A face-to-face conversation, quiet and strange and treated by the show with an unusual degree of earnestness. During that conversation, God tells Homer that he will one day learn the meaning of life, but that the time is not yet. God tells Homer his time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is precise. God told Homer that something significant was approaching, that his ordinary waking life was moving toward a threshold. And 6 months after that promise, or warning, Homer's vending machine fell and his conscious life ended. The show presents the God conversation as a quirky theological gag, a warm detour in an episode about Homer skipping church, but read through the lens of what happens 6 months later, it becomes something else. It becomes a prophecy. God was telling Homer that his time as a waking, conscious person in the world was nearly up, that everything that followed would happen in a different register. That the adventures and the absurdity and the celebrity appearances and the impossible jobs were coming, but not as real events, as dreams. The aging problem is where the coma theory operates most elegantly. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle or a gray hair. The show uses what is called a floating timeline, where the present is always the viewer's present, the characters always contemporary with the audience, never dating themselves by aging into a different decade. Most animated shows use this device. Most viewers accept it without examination. The radiation theory offers one explanation for the aging freeze, suggesting that chronic nuclear exposure has altered the character's biology at the cellular level, preventing the normal aging process from advancing. The cartoon logic explanation says it is simply how animated shows work, a production convention rather than a narrative choice. But the coma theory has the simplest answer, and also the one that lands the hardest. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing older because he was not there to see it happen. His children were 10 and 8 and 1 when he went under. His mind has no template for what they look like at 11 and 9. His memory of them is frozen at the moment the vending machine fell. So in the dream, they stay frozen. Bart is 10 forever. Lisa is 8 forever. Maggie keeps her pacifier forever. Not because the show is lazy about aging, but because Homer's dreaming mind can only produce what it has reference material for, and its last reference was a moment in April 1993, when his son was 10 and his daughter was 8, and his baby had just started sitting up on her own. Homer's coma dream preserves the world exactly as it was on the day he lost it. Because that is what coma minds do, at least within the logic that the theory proposes. They lock you in place. They freeze the world at the last moment you experienced it, with full clarity. And every episode since April 1993 is Homer's brain running the same simulation over and over, using the only reference material it has, the world as it existed on the day he went under. The celebrity appearances in later seasons fit this framework in a way that is difficult to dismiss. After season 4, the show becomes flooded with famous guest appearances. Celebrities show up in Springfield at a rate that makes no narrative sense if you accept the premise that Springfield is a normal American town. Actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, all finding their way to this mid-sized town in an unspecified state for reasons that are usually contrived to the point of parody. The sheer volume of it is one of the most commented on aspects of the show's later seasons, often cited as evidence of the writers running out of ideas and substituting star power for storytelling. The coma theory reframes it entirely. Homer's brain, lying in that hospital bed, is receiving ambient input from the world around it. Television sounds, voices of visitors, the radio at the nurse's station, fragments of cultural noise filtering through the fog of unconsciousness and being absorbed, processed, incorporated into the dream. His dreaming mind hears names and voices and references and weaves them into the simulation. The celebrities are not there because Springfield is unusually interesting. They are there because Homer's brain is absorbing the outside world in fragments and translating those fragments into dream characters. Every celebrity guest appearance is a voice Homer heard through the haze of unconsciousness, reassembled into a form his dreaming mind can use to populate a scene. The show has acknowledged the theory in its own sideways manner. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a leaked, deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma to discover that every outlandish episode was a dream. The scene was animated. It was voiced. It was presented to the audience. And then the show immediately declared it a hoax, a scene planted by hackers, not real, not canonical, move along. But the fact that it was made at all tells you something. The writers know about the theory. They have engaged with it closely enough to animate a response to it. They have acknowledged, in the act of creating that scene, that the theory holds together. Their denial, their insistence that Homer is not in a coma, came wrapped inside an episode that explicitly depicted Homer waking up from one. They showed you the truth and told you it was a joke. And the audience laughed, in the same way Homer laughed when he was told he had lost 5% of his brain, without fully understanding why. Al Jean, the show's longtime executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it is not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma, or why the show has become progressively more surreal and detached from recognizable reality across decades of episodes, or why that trajectory of increasing unreality maps so precisely onto the trajectory you would expect from a dream being generated by a brain that is slowly losing coherence. He said it was not true, and moved on. But the theory makes the show make sense. All of it. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the increasingly unmoored plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes. The fact that Homer can survive anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him because his mind is the one telling the story. And here is the part that takes up residence in you after you encounter the theory and does not leave. If the coma theory is true, the emotional core of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is grief. Homer's deepest wish, the wish that powers every episode of a show that has been running for longer than most of its viewers have been alive, is the simplest wish a person can have. He wants his family. That is the whole of it. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, exasperating, warm-hearted boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone badly in her room. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants Friday night at the Simpson house to last forever, with the television on and the beer cold and the family together under one roof on Evergreen Terrace. In the coma, it does last forever. The dream gives him everything he wants. His family preserved in amber, his children never growing up and moving away, his wife never leaving, his life never ending. The dream is not a nightmare. The dream is the only heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house where the kids are always young, a couch where the family always assembles, a town where nothing permanently changes and no one ever has to say goodbye. Every impossible adventure, every celebrity encounter, every plot that defies physics and logic and narrative plausibility, all of it is the dream elaborating on itself, getting stranger and more unmoored as the underlying brain deteriorates, losing its grip on coherent simulation, generating wilder and more fantastic scenarios because the ordinary logic of a grounded family sitcom is harder and harder to sustain from the depths of a coma that has now lasted 3 decades. And every time the credits roll and everything goes back to normal, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, Homer has to face what happens when the dream stops. He has to find out how much time has passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed. Whether the hospital room is quiet now, and the chair beside his bed is empty, and the world went on without him while he was busy dreaming about it, the coma theory is the most humane reading of The Simpsons that exists. It takes every absurdity and every inconsistency and every impossible thing that has ever happened in Springfield and turns them into evidence of a man's love for the people who defined his life. The show is not a cartoon about a dysfunctional family. The show is a love letter from an unconscious father to a family he cannot reach. Every episode is another iteration of the same dream, the same house, the same family, held together by the same pure and wordless wish that the world will still be there when he opens his eyes. The show will never confirm this. It cannot confirm it without ending. And the show cannot end, because the show ending means Homer waking up, and Homer waking up means finding out, and finding out is the one thing the dream was built to protect him from. So the dream continues. The timeline keeps floating. Bart stays 10. Lisa stays 8. Maggie keeps her pacifier. Homer keeps stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant. And the family keeps assembling on the couch. And the television keeps playing. And Springfield keeps going. Because in Homer's dream, it always does. Section 4. The night Mona kissed her son goodbye. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the established fact, delivered by Abe Simpson early in the show's run and never revisited. Homer's mother had died when he was young. He had grown up without her. He had mourned her in the quiet, formless way that children mourn the people they lose before they are old enough to understand what loss means. Abe had shown him a grave. Homer had accepted the story. And the show had moved on to other things. But the story Abe told was a lie. In Season 7, in the episode called Mother Simpson, which aired on November 19th, 1995, the lie comes undone. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, a characteristically absurd premise that quickly becomes something else entirely when he goes to correct the clerical error at the Hall of Records and discovers, buried in the municipal files of Springfield, that his mother is alive. She has always been alive. The grave Abe showed him belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been pointing at a famous writer's headstone and calling it his wife's for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She does not recognize him at first. He is not the child she left. He is a middle-aged man with a job at a nuclear plant and a family and 30 years of accumulated living on him. But when the recognition comes, when the moment of reunion arrives, the show does something it rarely does. It earns the emotion entirely. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him the truth about why she left. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was, by any ordinary measure, unremarkable. A woman living a quiet life in Springfield while the world outside was burning through the civil rights movement and the counterculture and the protests against Vietnam, and then something shifted in her. The show depicts it with its characteristic blend of absurdity and emotional authenticity. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists whom the show describes as hippies, though the show also makes clear, in the way it makes things clear, that their cause was entirely legitimate. Their target was a biological weapons laboratory owned by Charles Montgomery Burns, not a nuclear plant, a germ warfare facility. Burns did not only operate a nuclear power plant in Springfield, he owned a laboratory in the same community, manufacturing biological weapons, weapon-grade pathogens, engineered diseases, the kind of material that belongs in a military facility under the tightest possible security and most certainly not in a residential area where children played and families lived and people bought groceries without any knowledge of what was happening in the building down the road. Burns was cooking up diseases in Springfield. He had been doing it for years, presumably for profit, presumably as part of some arrangement with defense contractors or foreign governments or any of the other entities that would pay for access to biological weapons if the price was competitive. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to neutralize and destroy the biological agents stored inside. The raid was successful. The pathogens were destroyed. The weapons program was dismantled overnight by a small group of activists who had decided that someone needed to do something about the building down the road. As the group fled, Mona made a mistake. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos of the raid. She stopped to help them. She bent down, reached out, provided assistance to a person who had fallen during the confusion of a break-in she had organized. The person she stopped to help was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns looked up at her face and memorized it, and reported it to the FBI, and from that moment Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home, she could not contact Abe. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was disappearing or tell him that the choice was not about him, that it was never about him, that if she could have stayed, she would have stayed, that leaving was the only way to keep them safe from the man who now had the resources of federal law enforcement pointed at her face. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared into the night. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. Homer spent the next 30 years of his life believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather leave than raise. This is the wound at the center of Homer Simpson. Every piece of his personality, the desperate need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the willingness to endure humiliation and disrespect, and being forgotten rather than risk losing the stable things in his life, all of it traces back to a bedroom in Springfield in 1969, where a woman kissed a sleeping child goodbye and walked out into a night that Burns had engineered for her. Burns did not simply destroy Mona's life. He destroyed Homer's childhood. He took a boy's mother away when the boy was young enough that the absence would shape everything that followed. He ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally fractured, perpetually reaching for the approval of authority figures, constitutionally incapable of challenging power, desperate enough for stability that he would accept terrible treatment from an employer rather than risk the loss of his paycheck. And then, having engineered that emotional architecture in Homer from the age of 6, Burns hired him. Homer Simpson works at the power plant because Burns broke him as a child, and the broken version of Homer is exactly the employee Burns needs. He does not ask questions. He does not report violations. He does not speak to regulatory bodies or union representatives or investigative journalists. He shows up, he eats his donuts, he sleeps at his workstation, and he cashes his paycheck and goes home to the family that is the only thing preventing his carefully constructed emotional damage from expressing itself in ways that might cause problems. The show confirms the engineered nature of Homer's employment in a later revelation. Burns had committed a crime. Grandpa Simpson discovered it. The nature of the crime is not fully specified, but it was significant enough that Burns considered it worth managing rather than risking. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would have a job at the plant permanently, regardless of his performance, regardless of the number of documented safety failures, regardless of anything that happened between Homer and the facility's operational standards. The guarantee was contractual and it was maintained in secret, and Homer was never told about it because telling Homer would require explaining the rest. 742 documented errors. That is how many times Homer has failed at his job in ways that would result in immediate termination in any normally functioning workplace. And he was never let go. He was protected by a deal struck between his grandfather and the man who had destroyed his family, brokered in silence, maintained across decades, never disclosed to the person whose livelihood it controlled. Homer's job security was not luck or cartoon convenience. It was the continuation of Burns's leverage over the Simpson family, extended from one generation to the next, from Grandpa's silence to Homer's employment, to the radiation-saturated life of a man who works every day for the person who stole his mother. And Homer does not connect the dots. He does not confront Burns when he learns the truth about Mona. He does not quit. He does not even seem to fully process the relationship between the billionaire who signs his checks and the billionaire who drove his mother underground. The connection is there. The evidence is laid out in front of him with complete clarity in the episode that reveals his mother's story. The man who employs him is the man who destroyed his family. Those two facts share the same space in Homer's mind, and they do not connect. The crayon explains this. The radiation explains this. Decades of cognitive erosion from living in Springfield's contaminated environment explain this. Homer is too damaged to see the architecture of his own suffering. He can feel the weight of it. The show has given him moments where that weight becomes visible, where the accumulated grief of 30 years without a mother surfaces in his face and in his voice and in the way he sits very still for a second before the joke comes and everything goes back to the usual register. But he cannot follow the logic. He cannot trace the chain from Burns's germ warfare lab to Mona's midnight departure to his own crayon-impaired brain to the paycheck that comes from the same cracked, leaking facility that poisoned the water his children drink. He cannot see it because Burns made sure the person who would have to see it would not be capable of the seeing. This is the conspiracy that the radiation theory and the Mona Simpson story converge on together, and it is more disturbing than any theory about aliens or alternate timelines or secret societies. Burns did not simply build a nuclear plant and allow it to leak. He built a biological weapons facility in a residential area. He pursued a woman who destroyed that facility for 27 years, using federal law enforcement as a personal vendetta machine. He corrupted the municipal government of a town, its judiciary, its regulatory oversight, its medical establishment. He struck a deal with a retired soldier to guarantee the employment of the soldier's cognitively impaired son in exchange for the soldier's permanent silence about a crime. And he sat at the top of all of it, in his office above the reactor, ancient and glowing and aware of every thread he had pulled and every life he had bent into the shape he needed it to take. 3 generations of the Simpson family, broken by one man's grudge and one man's greed. Grandpa made a deal with the devil and buried the truth in a grave with Walt Whitman's name on it. Mona fought the devil and lost everything. Her home, her family, her son's childhood, the ordinary life she might have had if she had never decided to drive to that lab in 1969 and do something about what she found there. And Homer inherited the consequences of both of them. Born into the aftermath of his grandfather's silence and his mother's courage and his employer's cruelty, raised in the shadow of all 3, carrying the weight of all 3 in a brain damaged enough by radiation and crayon and grief that it cannot hold the full picture long enough to understand what the picture shows. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The show handles her death with a restraint that is unusual for it, and all the more devastating for that restraint. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. No joke, no cutaway, no reset. Just a man and his mother and the weight of 27 stolen years pressing down on both of them in a quiet room while the rest of Springfield goes about its usual business outside. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath all the comedy, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling down and getting back up, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's inability to resist that power. Mona fought and lost everything. Abe surrendered and lost his integrity. Homer survived and lost the capacity to understand what he survived. And Burns won, because Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules, and the rules say that Homer Simpson will keep working at the power plant until the day he dies, because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest and oldest and most medically maintained man in America needed a broken man in Sector 7G, and Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. He was broken on the night his mother kissed him goodbye in a dark bedroom in 1969 and disappeared into a future neither of them had chosen. Section 5. Who really shot Minna Burns? We know the official answer. Season 7, Episode 1. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 2. The case was resolved. Maggie Simpson pulled the trigger. The baby did it. Case closed. Move on. Everything is fine. Except the case was never really closed, because the evidence does not add up the way the show wants you to believe it does. And the more you examine this mystery, the more the official answer starts to look like a cover story rather than a conclusion. Let's go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. The summer of 1995. The Simpsons did something that had never been attempted by an animated show before. A genuine whodunit cliffhanger, constructed with the deliberate architecture of a mystery and promoted to the audience as a solvable puzzle. The show's creators invited viewers across America to submit their guesses for Who Shot Burns. The prize was significant. The winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. Fox promoted the contest like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional crime like a real unsolved case. The Simpsons was not simply a television show that summer. It was a national puzzle, and 30 million people were working on it simultaneously. The puzzle was this. Mr. Burns had gone too far. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget. He had driven Moe's Tavern into bankruptcy. He had created a sinkhole that swallowed the Springfield retirement castle. He had injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in a car accident. And for his finale, he had built a device to block the sun over the entire town, covering every square mile of Springfield in permanent shadow, forcing every resident to buy their electricity exclusively from his plant because without sunlight they had no other option. He stole the sun from the people of Springfield so he could charge them for the darkness. When Smithers objected, Burns fired him. By the end of Part 1, the entire population of Springfield had a reason to want Burns dead. The show made this explicit. It took its time building individual motives for dozens of characters. Homer, because Burns had worked alongside him for years and still could not remember his name. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because his job at the school was eliminated. Tito Puente, because the music program was cut. Moe, because his bar collapsed. Even Smithers, freshly fired, humiliated, and spiraling into alcoholism. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. The tension was so thick that multiple characters were shown carrying weapons. And then Burns collapsed. A single gunshot wound. He staggered onto the town's sundial and fell, his hands landing on two letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, lying on his back looking up, M and S. The screen went black. America waited 3 months. Here is what happened when the answer came. The investigation plays out as a comedic procedural. Smithers confesses immediately. This seems to close the case. But Smithers's confession falls apart when it emerges that he was blackout drunk during the relevant period and had actually shot someone else entirely. Old Jasper, in his wooden leg. Wrong victim. Wrong crime. Wrong location. Smithers is eliminated. Suspects are picked up and cleared one by one. Skinner has an alibi. Moe has an alibi. Tito Puente has the greatest alibi in the show's history. A full musical number demonstrating that he channeled his rage into an original samba composition rather than into actual violence. The investigation stalls until police find an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis links it to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints are on the gun. He had the most obvious motive of anyone in Springfield. He is arrested. He is about to be convicted. And then Burns wakes up from his coma and identifies his shooter. It was Maggie. According to Burns's account, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop. His gun fell from his holster in the struggle. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. That is the official story. Now let's examine why it does not hold together. Start with the contest. Thousands upon thousands of entries were submitted. The show's creators, on the DVD commentary, acknowledged that from the randomly selected sample of entries they reviewed, not a single person guessed the correct answer. Nobody won. The person who received the prize was chosen randomly and given a cash payment instead of being animated into the show because they had not identified Maggie. The producers also acknowledged being aware of one individual who had posted the correct answer online on the night of the original broadcast, using a college internet account that was no longer active by the time the contest ended. They issued an open invitation for that person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what this means for a moment. The show's creators designed a mystery. They told the audience it was solvable from the clues embedded in Part 1. They built a national contest around the premise that a careful viewer could identify the shooter from the evidence available. And when the answer was revealed, essentially, no one had figured it out from those clues. Either the clues were insufficient for the solution they led to, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence in the way the show claimed. In either case, the mystery did not work as a mystery in the way the promotion had promised. Now look at the sundial clue, which the show presents as its central piece of evidence. Burns falls onto the sundial. His hands point to W and S, or from his prone position, M and S. The show tells us this signifies Maggie Simpson, M for Maggie, S for Simpson. And then it acknowledges, through Burns himself, that the positioning of his hands on those letters was not intentional. He fell. The letters are beneath his hands by chance. He was not deliberately pointing to his attacker's initials. He was collapsing from a bullet wound, and his body happened to come to rest in a particular position. The central clue in the greatest mystery in the show's history was confirmed as a coincidence by the victim himself. The gun presents a different problem. Before the shooting, Burns's holster is shown to be empty. The gun was missing from his person before the attack. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon. This narrows the field considerably because it eliminates every suspect who came to the town meeting already armed. Most of the suspects brought weapons. They were furious enough at Burns to consider violence, and they came prepared. The person who shot Burns was someone who did not bring a gun, who encountered Burns's gun by chance and who used it impulsively rather than as part of a plan. A baby finding a dropped gun fits this profile perfectly. So do roughly a dozen other characters who were not carrying weapons that night. Burns's last words before the shooting are the detail that lingers most uncomfortably. He said, before the gun went off, "Oh, it's you. Not who are you, not stay back." Not a response appropriate to encountering a stranger or a threat. "Oh, it's you." Casual recognition. The acknowledgement of someone familiar. Someone Burns had encountered before and did not feel threatened by. The question is whether Burns would say that upon seeing Maggie Simpson. Has Burns ever met Maggie in any meaningful context prior to this moment? The show does not establish a relationship between them. Burns barely recognizes Homer, a man who has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would look at a baby in a parking lot and respond with the specific warm familiarity of, "Oh, it's you," rather than some expression of confusion or alarm, does not fit the character as established. That phrase belongs to the greeting of someone known, someone whose presence in this location makes some kind of sense even if it is unexpected. In season 18, Homer claims, on camera, to have been the person who actually shot Burns. He says this out loud, in conversation, as if it is simply a fact he is acknowledging. Nobody reacts. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the richest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line, unworthy of follow-up. Two readings exist for this moment. Either Homer is lying for the attention that confessing to a famous crime provides, which is entirely consistent with his character and entirely possible given his history of exaggeration. Or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer said it because he knows, because he was there, because Maggie did not pull that trigger. If Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. A baby was blamed for her father's crime. The evidence that convicted her, the DNA on Burns's suit, the sundial coincidence, the testimony of a man who had just woken from a coma with a bullet wound, was either manufactured, misread, or accepted because accepting it was convenient. Chief Wiggum says it himself in the resolution episode. No jury in the world would convict a baby, except maybe Texas. Maggie is the perfect suspect for a cover-up. She cannot be prosecuted. She cannot be sentenced. She cannot even coherently deny the accusation. She is an infant who cannot form sentences. Blaming Maggie closes the case, protects the real shooter, and produces zero legal consequences for anyone. It is the cleanest possible resolution to a crime that the town's power structure had every reason to bury quickly. The Marge theory is the one that has gathered the most sustained support among people who have looked at this closely. The case for Marge is not circumstantial. It is surprisingly direct. Marge watched Burns destroy her children's school. She watched him injure her family's dog. She watched him steal the sun from her town. She is a devoted mother who has spent years containing her feelings about the way the world treats her family, tamping down her reactions, maintaining the domestic equilibrium of a household that is held together largely by her will and her patience. And she had a motive that none of the other suspects could match. Not abstract injury or financial loss or wounded pride, personal, specific, mother's rage on behalf of her children. Burns had been in love with Marge. An earlier episode established this directly, depicting Burns's infatuation with Marge in terms that made clear he considered her something other than simply a subordinate's wife. And the Marge theory argues that this history explains the one piece of evidence that nothing else explains: Burns's behavior after waking from his coma. He identified his shooter. He named Maggie. He did not name Marge. If Burns recognized Marge in that parking lot, the "oh, it's you" makes perfect sense. He knew her. He had feelings about her. He did not consider her a threat. He may even have been surprised and pleased to see her, the way a man is surprised and pleased to see someone he has thought about. And then the gun went off, and Burns was lying on the sundial, and when he woke up, he had a choice about what to say. He chose to protect her. He pointed at the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions. He was the victim. He was the only witness. And he was a man who, despite all of his cruelty and all of his machinations, could not bring himself to name the woman who had shot him, because he would rather absorb the bullet than absorb that particular consequence. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was convenient. Because she was the baby in the parking lot. Because blaming her closed the case without closing a jail door behind anyone. Because Chief Wiggum needed a resolution and Burns needed silence and the town needed to move on. The alternate endings prove that even the writers were not fully committed to the Maggie answer as a logical outcome. A complete alternate conclusion was animated in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Full-length, fully voiced, fully produced. This ending was shown in the episode The Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular, a clip show hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses the Smithers ending by noting that accepting it would require ignoring all the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be, in his words, downright nutty. And then the show makes the wink explicit. That line is a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which had recently concluded with a jury finding the defendant not guilty despite DNA evidence connecting him to the crime. The show is telling you that ignoring DNA evidence happens. It is telling you that the official answer is not always the right answer. It is telling you that evidence points in whatever direction the people managing the investigation need it to point. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it as a potential resolution. This was abandoned. But the cycling through multiple shooters before landing on Maggie reveals something important about the mystery's construction. The answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to accommodate whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was built in reverse. And here is the final question that no official account has ever satisfactorily answered. In a town where every single person had a motive, where dozens of people were carrying weapons, where the victim had just stolen the sun and threatened the survival of every living thing in the community, how is it that only one person acted? Springfield is not a restrained community. These people riot at the drop of a hat. They form mobs over trivial misunderstandings. They have burned down their own town hall once because of confusion about a bear sighting. The population's capacity for collective violence, when sufficiently provoked, is well documented across the show's entire run. And Burns blocked out the sun. He destroyed the retirement home. He bankrupted businesses. He injured animals. He threatened the entire agricultural and economic ecosystem of the town in one afternoon. And only one person fired a gun. Either Springfield's population displayed an uncharacteristic restraint that is completely inconsistent with their established behavior, or the shooting was not the spontaneous act of a single individual in a parking lot. Maybe it was planned. Maybe someone knew Burns' schedule, had access to his gun, and had enough influence to redirect the investigation away from themselves and toward a target who could never be convicted. Smithers. Homer. Marge. Someone else whose motive the show's framing made easy to overlook because the show wanted you looking somewhere else. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The contest that nobody won, the clues that Burns himself said were accidental, the alternate endings that were fully animated, Homer's unexamined confession, the final shot of Maggie alone in the room, checking that no one is watching before mimicking the motion of a trigger, all of it suggests that the greatest mystery in the show's history was never actually solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those two things have never been the same. Section 6. Maggie's Secret. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates primarily through pacifier sounds and the occasional precisely targeted stare. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She is the smallest member of the Simpson family, the quietest, the one who receives the least attention and generates the least narrative consequence across the show's run. And she is, by any serious measure of the evidence the show has provided, the most capable member of the Simpson family. The most dangerous person on Evergreen Terrace. Possibly the most dangerous person in Springfield. Let's start with the shooting, because it defined how the public understands Maggie. But the shooting is actually the least interesting thing about her. Regardless of whether Maggie actually pulled that trigger, the aftermath is the thing that matters. A baby was identified as having committed an act of violence against the richest man in town. The evidence was examined. The police investigated. And the conclusion was that yes, this infant had shot a man, and the legal system had no mechanism for responding to it. Chief Wiggum made it explicit. No jury in the world would convict a baby. The case was closed. Maggie went home. And then, in the final shot of the episode, when everyone else had left the room and Maggie was alone, she looked around carefully. She checked her surroundings. She confirmed that no one was watching, and then she moved her pacifier in a deliberate motion that replicated the action of pulling a trigger. Watch that sequence closely. That is not reflexive behavior. That is not a baby making random movements with her mouth. The sequence consists of 4 distinct steps: looking around, confirming the absence of observers, waiting, then acting. That is a security check followed by a private reenactment. Those 4 steps require situational awareness, memory, caution, and the ability to defer an impulse until the environment is assessed as safe. These are not traits associated with infants. These are traits associated with someone who understands exactly what they did, understands that it had significance, understands that repeating it in front of others would produce consequences, and has decided that privacy is the appropriate context for acknowledging what happened. She was 1 year old. The Longest Daycare expands on this. Released in 2012 as a theatrical short screened before Ice Age, Continental Drift, the film was nominated for an Academy Award, and it is 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson demonstrating cognitive abilities that would be remarkable in an adult. The premise places her in the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare run with authoritarian efficiency. Maggie encounters a caterpillar on the verge of becoming a butterfly. Another baby, a bully named Gerald, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's security systems to protect the caterpillar and release it safely. She does all of this without speaking a word. She does it through observation. She maps the environment, identifying the threats and the resources and the constraints before acting on any of them. She develops strategy on the fly, adapting her approach as circumstances change and earlier plans become untenable. She executes multi-step sequences that require precise timing, spatial awareness, and the ability to predict other people's behavior based on their established patterns. And she does all of this while being physically constrained to the motor skills of a 1-year-old body. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when her plan requires running. Her body cannot keep up with her mind. But her decision-making is flawless. Every choice she makes in the film is the correct choice. Every adaptation is appropriate. Every reevaluation of circumstances is accurate. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support, and she succeeds anyway because the intelligence compensates for every limitation the body imposes. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly on multiple occasions. The results depend on the episode and the comedic needs of the moment, but the pattern is consistent. Maggie's intelligence registers as extraordinary, off the charts, beyond what standardized testing is designed to measure. The show plays this for quick laughs and moves on. But the accumulation of these moments across decades of episodes builds into something that demands a different kind of attention. Maggie is not a normal baby. She has never been a normal baby. And the family consistently fails to register this because they are too occupied with Homer's disasters and Bart's provocations and Lisa's crusades to notice the baby who has been solving problems in the background of every episode quietly, efficiently, without acknowledgement or credit. And this brings us to the silence. Maggie's silence is the show's most interesting ongoing mystery. It is not a developmental issue. The show has demonstrated repeatedly that Maggie can speak. Her first word, Daddy, was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in one of the show's most celebrated cameo moments. It happened once and was never repeated. Maggie has gone 36 years without developing language in any meaningful way in the context of the show's regular episodes. She is surrounded by a family of extremely verbal people. Homer cannot stop talking. Marge expresses herself constantly in the particular vocabulary of maternal anxiety. Bart provokes and jokes and narrates. Lisa lectures and analyzes and advocates. The Simpson house is a wall of continuous noise. And in the middle of all of it, Maggie sits in silence. Watching, listening, processing. The theory is that Maggie's silence is not developmental delay. It is strategy. It is the deliberate choice of a mind intelligent enough to recognize that not being noticed is the most powerful position available to someone in her circumstances. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is a genius. Her IQ is documented. Her capabilities are not in question. She is the most analytically gifted member of the family and arguably one of the most capable thinkers in Springfield. And what has her intelligence gotten her? Isolation, mockery from her peers, dismissal from adults who find her precocity more threatening than impressive. She speaks up and gets talked over. She challenges authority and gets disciplined. She attempts to improve the world around her and encounters the combined resistance of a community that has no use for improvement, because improvement would require acknowledging that the status quo is a problem. Lisa's intelligence is her defining characteristic and also the thing that makes her life in Springfield most difficult. She wears her intelligence on the outside. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room. And the room responds by making her feel the full cost of that distinction. Maggie watched this happen. Maggie has been watching it happen since she was born. She has observed her sister fight every day for recognition and receive nothing but resistance from a household and a community that rewards compliance and punishes insight. She has learned, in whatever way a one-year-old genius learns things, that Lisa's strategy is unsustainable. That making your intelligence visible in Springfield is a guaranteed path to being worn down by a community that cannot afford to acknowledge what you represent. So Maggie chose differently. She chose invisibility. She chose silence. She chose to present herself as exactly what everyone expects a baby to be: passive, helpless, dependent, incapable of complex thought or independent action. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them. And she has maintained the performance for 36 years without anyone in her family or community catching on, because the performance is so complete, so consistent, and so well calibrated to what people expect to see that it never once prompts someone to look closer. Think about the operational implications of this. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, what happens? Nobody notices, nobody investigates. The Burns shooting investigation focused on every adult suspect in Springfield before even considering the baby. The daycare rebellion succeeded entirely because adult supervision of infants is structurally loose, predicated on the assumption that babies cannot organize, cannot strategize, cannot identify their oppressor and coordinate a resistance. Every heroic act, every demonstration of intelligence, every moment where Maggie intervenes in a situation that required intervention, it happens below the radar, in the spaces where no one is paying attention, exactly as she has arranged it. Maggie has built herself the most effective cover identity available. She is a baby. She will always be a baby. Nobody suspects the baby. Connect this to the radiation theory and something interesting happens. The radiation theory proposes that Springfield's contaminated environment creates mutations in the people exposed to it. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to clinical disability levels. But mutations do not operate uniformly. The same environmental cause, applied to different biological systems, produces different outcomes. Where Homer's brain was diminished, Maggie's was amplified. Same water, same air, same leaking reactor, same irradiated food supply. But where the father's neural architecture was degraded by exposure, the youngest child's was enhanced, pushed into a range of cognitive function that standard developmental frameworks have no category for. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive process. He is what happens when mutation takes something away. She is what happens when mutation gives something extraordinary back. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius carries a different kind of weight entirely. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is a product of an unconscious mind trying to hold on to the family it loves, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is not a mutation or a conspiracy or a theory. It is Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, projected onto the dream with the force of a father who knows he will not be there to protect her. He cannot watch her grow up. He cannot see what she becomes. He cannot be present for the moments that will define who she is. So in the dream, he makes her capable. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her apparent development. He builds her a mind that can protect her from anything, navigate anything, solve anything. Because if she can do all of that, then maybe, in the dream, it is okay that he is not there. Maybe she will be fine. Maybe his absence will not cost her everything. Her genius is not a mutation, it is a father's prayer. But in the waking interpretation, in the version where Springfield is real, and the radiation is real, and the power plant is real, and the damage is real, Maggie's silence remains the most interesting open question in the show. She has been watching. She has been accumulating. She has been building a perfect picture of every person in Springfield, every power structure, every vulnerability, every leverage point for 36 years. She knows things about this town that nobody else knows, because nobody else has been watching this carefully for this long, from a position that makes them essentially invisible. What is she waiting for? The show has never answered this. Maggie's endgame is the only truly unsolved personal mystery in the Simpson family. Her future is the only one that has never been definitively mapped, because the show has never shown her growing up in any canonical sense. Every other character has had their trajectory established. Homer will always be at the plant. Marge will always be maintaining the family. Bart will always be the irreverent kid who never quite figures out how to channel his energy constructively. Lisa will always be fighting, always brilliant, always isolated by the combination of her intelligence and her community's unwillingness to accommodate it. But Maggie is an open variable. And open variables in systems as tightly constructed as Springfield are not accidents. They are preparations. They are the show leaving a door unlatched, because what waits behind it is not yet ready to come through. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot speak in complete sentences. She has shot a man, led a daycare rebellion, saved a butterfly, and spent 36 years memorizing the town that made her. And when she finally decides to act, when the silence breaks and the pacifier falls, and whatever she has been building in the quiet behind those enormous eyes finally comes forward, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will. Because that is exactly how she designed it to be. Section 7. The Principal Who Wasn't. On September 28, 1997, Season 9's second episode aired. Its title was The Principal and the Pauper. The fan response was immediate, intense, and has never fully subsided. 28 years later, this episode is still cited as the moment the show betrayed its audience. The moment the writers stopped caring about continuity, stopped respecting what had been built, stopped honoring the trust of the people who had been watching since the beginning. But the fans have been reading the betrayal backwards. This episode did not break The Simpsons. It revealed what The Simpsons had always been. It showed you the mechanism underneath the comedy, the infrastructure of denial that had been running the town for its entire history, and the shock of seeing it exposed was so uncomfortable that audiences decided to call it bad writing rather than sit with what it was actually showing them. Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event celebrating Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger walks through the door. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, presumed dead, and who has now, after surviving his imprisonment and eventually making his way home, discovered that someone else has been living his life for the past 2 decades. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the Vietnam War, Tamzarian was a street punk, a petty criminal, a kid from the wrong side of a city with no future and no prospects and no one who expected anything from him. He was drafted. He served in the same military unit as the real Seymour Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian was consumed by guilt. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. But Agnes assumed the young soldier at her door was her son returned. She needed him to be her son. She clung to that belief with the desperation of a woman who could not survive the alternative. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth keeping, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name and the rank and the life and the mother. He lived inside the borrowed identity for 20 years, building a career and a relationship with his adopted community, becoming in every practical sense the person whose identity he had stolen. Then the real Skinner walked through the door, and the truth was fully exposed. Every person in Springfield was now aware that their principal was a fraud. The man who had been running their school, who had participated in their community for 2 decades, who had disciplined their children and attended their social events and argued with the superintendent and formed the fabric of institutional Springfield through the ordinary work of his presence, was not who he said he was. And then the town held a vote, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to restore the real Skinner to the identity that had been taken from him, on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict was unanimous. Springfield voted to maintain the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree that the imposter was the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who had survived a prisoner of war camp and traveled home to find his life occupied by someone else, was tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge made it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention the truth again. Let that settle. A community looked at a man who could prove that the official version of their reality was false. They had the evidence. They had the real person standing in front of them. And they voted to criminalize the truth, exile the person who carried it, and make the lie legally binding. Fans hated this episode with a passion that has not diminished over nearly 3 decades. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among other characters, publicly expressed his displeasure. Critics argued that the episode destroyed Skinner's character by revealing that everything established about him was built on fiction. His military service, his relationship with Agnes, his dynamic with Bart, his entire personality, all of it, retroactively delegitimized by the revelation that he was someone else. But here is the thing that the criticism consistently sidesteps. The episode is completely honest about what Springfield is. It just says the quiet part out loud. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed, through some unspoken social mechanism, to forget whatever doesn't fit the preferred narrative of a community where everything is basically fine. The only difference between this episode and every other is that here, the mechanism is visible. The vote happens on screen. The decree is read aloud. The exile of the truth carrier is explicit and documented rather than the usual process of things simply drifting away from memory until the inconvenient version is no longer present to cause trouble. Every other time Springfield ignores a catastrophe, resets after a world-altering event, forgets by the next episode that something irreversible happened, it occurs off-screen. The characters simply do not reference it. The slate is clean. The writers move on and the audience accepts it as the episodic format doing what episodic formats do. The Principal and the Pauper is the one time the show let you watch the erasure happen in real time. Consider the list of things Springfield should remember, but doesn't. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. It has been invaded, sealed under a glass dome by the federal government, subjected to multiple nuclear near incidents, visited by what appeared to be extraterrestrial life, had its sun blocked by a mechanical device operated by a billionaire who subsequently recovered from being shot without pressing charges. Every single one of these events, in any functioning community, in any real-world context, would produce permanent change. The aftermath would reshape the town's politics, its economy, its relationship to the institutions and the people involved. Nothing like these events passes without consequence in reality. In Springfield, the next episode always begins clean. Fan commentary typically describes this as episodic storytelling, the structural convention by which each episode is self-contained and the series resets to its default state so that new stories can be told. This is a valid observation. It is how the show is constructed. It is also not an adequate explanation for the pattern, because explaining the mechanism is not the same as accounting for what the pattern means within the show's own internal logic. The Principal and the Pauper offers that accounting. Springfield resets because Springfield chooses to reset, collectively, deliberately. Through a social contract that says the agreed-upon version of reality will be maintained regardless of contradicting evidence, and anyone who insists on the truth will be managed, marginalized, or removed from the community. The vote in the episode is simply the most explicit version of a process that happens continuously, invisibly, in the background of every episode that ever ended with the slate wiped clean. Real communities do this. Small towns in particular have a capacity for collective denial that larger urban environments, with their multiplicity of voices and contradicting accounts, struggle to sustain. Scandals get buried. Crimes get absorbed into the community's preferred self-image. Uncomfortable facts get revised through enough repetition of the preferred alternative that the alternative eventually displaces the original. The official version becomes the only version because the people who carry the original version have been quietly discouraged from continuing to carry it. Springfield is not unusual in this. Springfield is an exaggerated version of something real. The show has always known this. The principal and the pauper is not an anomaly in the show's history. It is the show's explanation of itself. Here is the logic chain that the episode reveals, once you trace it carefully. Springfield forgets the dome because forgetting the dome means not acknowledging the pollution. Not acknowledging the pollution means not confronting the plant. Not confronting the plant means not challenging Burns. Not challenging Burns means the economy survives. The economy surviving means the town survives. The town surviving means all of this. The yellow skin and the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who glows in the dark can continue indefinitely without requiring anyone to stand up in a public meeting and say something that cannot be unsaid. The collective amnesia is not a cognitive failure. It is a survival strategy. The people of Springfield are not forgetting because they cannot remember. They are forgetting because remembering is too expensive. And the real Seymour Skinner is the canary in the coal mine. He arrived carrying proof that the official narrative was a lie. He had documentation. He had physical presence. He was impossible to dismiss as rumor or exaggeration or the confused account of someone who misremembered. He was standing in the room, the actual person whose actual identity had been appropriated, and his presence made the truth impossible to avoid looking at. Springfield's response was not to thank him. It was to tie him to a train. Because the truth is only welcome in a community if the community can afford to act on it. And in Springfield, the cost of acting on the truth about its principal, its power plant, its water supply, its radiation-saturated biology, its compromised institutions, its ancient employer, is a cost that the town's economy and the town's psychology cannot sustain. So the truth gets the same treatment that every uncomfortable fact gets in Springfield. It gets exiled. And the last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal gets tied to a railroad car and shipped somewhere else, out of sight, out of jurisdiction, out of the community's agreed-upon field of vision. Armin Tamzarian is still in Springfield, still pretending to be Seymour Skinner, still running the same school where Bart Simpson has been 10 years old for 36 years, still maintaining the identity he borrowed and the town voted to make permanent. And the real Seymour Skinner is out there somewhere, in whatever landscape exists beyond the edges of Springfield's frame, carrying the truth about himself and the town and the mechanisms of denial that run both of them. The last honest man, exiled from his own life, because Springfield looked at what honesty would cost and decided the price was too high. Section 8. The town that cannot be found. Springfield is the most famous fictional American town in history. More people can name Springfield than can name the capital city of half the states in the country it supposedly exists within. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, an elementary school, a prison, 2 hospitals, and a quick E-Mart. It has mountains in the background of some episodes and ocean views in others. It borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you consult. It has experienced blizzards and tropical heat waves within the span of a single season. It is located on the coast and in the heartland and near the Canadian border and in the desert southwest, simultaneously and without apparent contradiction. Springfield does not exist in any single American state. Springfield exists in all of them at once. The show has been deliberately contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run. Every time an episode provides a clue that seems to narrow down the geography, a different episode provides a clue that contradicts the first one completely. Lisa's area code begins with 636, which is a Missouri prefix. The state abbreviation NT appears in one episode, which corresponds to no actual American state. When Homer calls the state capital, the voice on the other end establishes that the state name begins with a vowel, which eliminates some possibilities while leaving dozens of others viable. The show hands you breadcrumbs and then scatters them before you can follow them anywhere useful. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed this directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up, choosing the name because it is one of the most common city names in America. He chose it specifically because he wanted the town to feel like it could be anywhere, to resonate with viewers regardless of their actual geography. He confirmed the Oregon origin. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was solved. And then it wasn't, because the show kept going and the episodes kept contradicting the Oregon answer, and the writers declined to honor Groening's disclosure by actually setting the show there in any consistent way. The confession lasted less than 2 days before the show's ongoing reality made it irrelevant. This is not accidental. The deliberate unlocating of Springfield, the sustained, consistent refusal across 36 years of episodes to allow the town to have a fixed geographic identity, is one of the show's most sophisticated ongoing jokes. And like all the show's best jokes, it is also something more than a joke. Springfield's geographic impossibility is its most important feature. A town with no fixed location cannot be regulated by any fixed authority. It cannot be subject to consistent EPA oversight because its state jurisdiction keeps changing. It cannot be held accountable to any particular attorney general because no attorney general has consistent jurisdiction over it. It cannot be the subject of a sustained federal investigation because the jurisdictional framework collapses every time someone tries to establish it. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone arrives with a map and a badge and an interest in the three-eyed fish. Apply the radiation theory and the geographic impossibility becomes a natural extension of the contamination. If the radiation in Springfield's water supply and air and soil can alter the biology of every living thing within the town's boundaries, producing four-fingered humans and three-eyed fish, and hair that defies gravity and a man who glows in the dark, then why should geography be exempt? If the laws of biology have been sufficiently warped by decades of nuclear exposure, perhaps the laws of physical geography have been warped alongside them. Perhaps the radiation that mutated the fish also warped the space. Perhaps Springfield occupies a kind of geographic uncertainty, a quantum state of location where it exists in multiple states simultaneously because the contamination has extended the impossible to include the map itself. This is not, within the logic of the show's own universe, significantly stranger than anything else that has already been established. Springfield has already demonstrated that its physical laws operate differently from the outside world's physical laws. Adding geographic instability to the list of radiation-induced anomalies requires only a small extension of premises the show has already committed to. The coma theory offers a more emotionally resonant reading. Homer's brain, lying in that hospital bed, assembled Springfield from fragments of experience and memory and ambient cultural input. He has driven through the Midwest. He has seen the coast in photographs or on television. He has watched westerns with desert landscapes. He has lived in a town near mountains and heard about towns near oceans. His unconscious mind, building the dream landscape, drew from all of these sources without applying geographic logic, because dream geography operates on emotional logic rather than cartographic logic. The mountains are there because Homer associates mountains with something. The ocean is there because the ocean means something to the version of America that Homer's mind is trying to reconstruct. Springfield feels like everywhere because it was assembled from everywhere, from every American landscape that has ever made an impression on a man who grew up in front of a television in a town near a nuclear reactor and absorbed the full spectrum of American geographical mythology through the medium of pop culture before the vending machine fell and the dream began. The Springfield of Homer's coma is the America of Homer's memory, compressed into a single town, defying the ordinary constraints of physical geography because dreams do not honor those constraints, because the emotional resonance of a place matters more than its GPS coordinates, because what Homer needed when he built this world was not accuracy but familiarity. The principle and the pauper reading offers a third interpretation, bleaker and more precise. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. If the jurisdiction is permanently undefined, if the regulatory authority is perpetually unclear, if the state changes with each episode, and the legal framework resets alongside the narrative, then the nuclear plant's violations cannot be systematically pursued. The biological weapons facility that Burns operated cannot be connected to a specific regulatory body with the authority to prosecute. The contamination cannot be attributed to a specific municipality with the standing to sue. The three-eyed fish swims in a river that cannot be definitively placed in any particular EPA district, and nobody can compel testing of water that flows through a town that may or may not be in their jurisdiction, depending on which episode of a television show you consult. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is not a comedy device that incidentally provides regulatory cover. It is, within the logic of a town run by a man who has been evading accountability for over a century, a feature, a carefully maintained feature. A piece of infrastructure as deliberately constructed as the legal agreements that protect Homer's job, and the medical treatments that keep Burns alive, and the collective amnesia that keeps the population from connecting the dots. The show demonstrated its awareness of this in the episode Behind the Laughter, a mockumentary format episode from season 12, in which the Simpsons are depicted as a real family whose lives became the basis for the fictional television show. In the original broadcast, the family is identified as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, this was changed to a different state. The answer to where Springfield is literally depends on which version of the same episode you are watching. The show gave you a definitive answer and then changed the definitive answer depending on the platform of distribution. Even when Springfield has a location, that location is not stable. It shifts. It revises itself. It refuses to be pinned down. In the same way that every truth in Springfield refuses to be pinned down, because pinning things down is how accountability arrives, and accountability is the one thing that the infrastructure of this town was built to prevent. Every state in America has been proposed as Springfield's home at some point. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence refuting it. The show has generated more geographic contradictions than any show in television history, and it has maintained them with the same patient consistency that it has maintained the yellow skin and the floating timeline and the billionaire's impossible age. Springfield will never be located, not because the show cannot decide, because the show decided, early and permanently, that Springfield is more useful as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone, and a town that belongs to everyone, that is simultaneously every American community that has ever existed, that carries within it the industrial decay of the Rust Belt, and the suburban sprawl of the Sun Belt, and the small-town insularity of New England, and the wide blankness of the Midwest. That town is the show's most honest and most important creation. Because what the show has been making for 36 years is not a show about Springfield, Oregon. It is a show about America. About the specific American tendency to live alongside enormous dysfunction without naming it. To watch the fish grow a third eye and file it away as local color rather than evidence. To work for the man who poisoned your water and accept the paycheck with gratitude. To hold a public meeting about the literal theft of the sun and then go home for dinner without fundamentally changing the structures that made the theft possible. Springfield cannot be found on a map because Springfield is not a place. It is a condition, and conditions do not have zip codes. Section 9. The Predictions. In the year 2000, The Simpsons aired an episode called Bart to the Future. In that episode, a vision of the future showed Lisa Simpson as the first female president of the United States. Her predecessor in the Oval Office was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the presidential election of 2016. The internet's response, when the connection was noticed, was essentially a collective short circuit. Screenshots circulated at a volume that transcended the show's existing fan base and entered general cultural consciousness. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in years were sharing clips and asking the question that the parallel seemed to demand. How did they know? The Trump prediction became shorthand for a phenomenon that had been building for years. The idea that The Simpsons was not merely a cartoon but something more, a text with prophetic properties, a record of future events somehow encoded into the scripts of a primetime animated comedy. And the Trump example was just the most famous data point in what had become a very long list. In 1995, the show depicted a device strapped to a character's wrist that functioned like a modern smartwatch. In 1994, Homer went to space in a civilian capacity with Buzz Aldrin, decades before the commercial space tourism industry existed as a functioning enterprise. In 1998, Homer scrawled a mathematical equation on a blackboard that appeared to physicists who encountered it years later to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was not experimentally confirmed until 2012. In 1999, Homer proposed a theory about the shape of the universe being toroidal, donut-shaped, and years later cosmologists found radiation patterns in the cosmic microwave background that suggested the universe might actually have that geometry. In 1993, an episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia spreading to Springfield, causing mass panic, widespread illness, panic buying, and a frantic search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. And during the fictional outbreak, the townspeople accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which acquired a bizarre resonance when Asian giant hornets, quickly nicknamed murder hornets by media outlets, appeared in the United States during the actual pandemic of 2020. In 1996, the show's Homerpalooza episode featured a joke in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra while in an altered state. That specific collaboration, Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra, actually happened in 2024 at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years between the joke and its realization. In 1998, a brief visual gag depicted a newspaper headline announcing that Disney had acquired 20th Century Fox. Disney's actual acquisition of 20th Century Fox was completed in 2019. The list continues. It always continues, and every time a new item is added, the response cycle restarts. The amazement, the suspicion, the question about whether the writers have access to information that the rest of the population does not, the theories about prediction engines and insider knowledge and prophetic algorithms embedded in the structure of the show's creative process. The people who actually make the show have a simple, direct, and completely unromantic answer. Al Jean has stated it plainly. If you throw enough darts, you will hit some bullseyes. That is his explanation. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, references, and satirical observations about American culture, technology, politics, economics, and society. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some of it will align with future events through sheer statistical probability. The hits are memorable. The misses are forgotten. The ratio of accurate predictions to inaccurate predictions is actually quite low, but the confirmation bias of collective memory ensures that only the accurate ones get shared and discussed and turned into screenshots. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it even more directly. The episodes are so old that history repeats itself. What looks like prediction is largely coincidence, because the show has been running long enough that the cyclical nature of culture and politics and technology has brought reality around to some of the same places that the show visited years earlier. Fact-checking organizations have worked through the most prominent claims systematically, and the pattern they found is consistent. Most of the supposed predictions are based on trends that were already visible when the episodes were written. The Trump example is the clearest case. Trump had been publicly exploring the idea of a presidential run since the late 1980s. He had run for the Reform Party nomination in 2000. He was a fixture of American political commentary as a candidate of the celebrity entering politics variety for decades before he actually ran. The writers of Bart to the Future did not predict Trump's election. They observed a pattern that had been in motion for over a decade and extrapolated it to its logical destination. Celebrity culture intersects with politics and produces a celebrity politician. This was not prophecy, it was trend analysis. The Disney-Fox merger prediction follows the same logic. Media consolidation was an accelerating and well-documented trend in the late 1990s. Major studios were acquiring each other at a pace that made a single mega-corporation controlling the entertainment industry feel like an obvious destination. The joke was not a prediction of a specific merger. It was a satirical observation about a pattern that was already expressing itself in the industry, pushed to its logical and most absurd conclusion. The smartwatch observation reflects the general direction of technology miniaturization, which was visible to anyone following the field in the mid-90s. The commercial space tourism prediction reflects the obvious trajectory of a space industry that was already, by the mid-90s, exploring privatization. These are not prophecies. They are the outputs of a writing staff that paid unusually close attention to the world around them and then extrapolated what they saw. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most formally educated in television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other institutions with strong mathematics, science, and policy programs. Several have backgrounds in fields that involve the rigorous analysis of systems and trends. These are not people guessing randomly. They are people who were trained, in many cases, to look at a pattern of data and project where it leads. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the present more carefully than most people do, and then pushing it forward a few steps to its logical conclusion. But here is where the explanation becomes insufficient. Because the debunking framework handles most of the predictions elegantly, and it handles them honestly, but there are specific cases where the precision of the alignment stretches statistical probability past the point where coincidence is a comfortable explanation. The Trump escalator moment is the one that gets cited most often. The Bart to the Future episode did not just predict a Trump presidency in general terms. It depicted a specific visual, a figure descending from a high structure into a public announcement. In 2015, when Trump launched his actual campaign, he descended an escalator in Trump Tower to reach the podium where he announced his candidacy. The visual echo between the fictional version and the real version is precise in a way that trend analysis does not fully account for. Trend analysis says Trump might become president. It does not generate a specific image of a man coming down from a height to address a crowd. The Siegfried and Roy episode depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers during a live show. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically injured during a performance when one of the act's white tigers attacked him. The show did not predict that exotic animal performers might eventually face danger from their animals, which would be trend analysis of a banal kind. It predicted the specific species, the specific context, and a specific kind of attack on a specific kind of performer. These cases sit in a different category from the trend extrapolations. They are specific enough that the dart metaphor starts to feel strained. This is where the most interesting theory in this space emerges, and it is more interesting than any version of the prophecy explanation because it does not require the writers to have supernatural foreknowledge. It requires only that the show be what it already demonstrably is. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes the future. Not through magic, not through any mechanism more exotic than cultural influence. Through the simple, documented, well-understood process by which a piece of media that reaches tens of millions of people over decades becomes part of the shared vocabulary of the culture, altering what feels possible, normalizing what felt extreme, making certain futures feel inevitable rather than unlikely. When The Simpsons made a joke about a Trump presidency in 2000, that joke entered the cultural bloodstream of an audience of 30 million people. It became a reference point, a piece of shared vocabulary, something people mentioned at dinner parties when Trump appeared on the news, something that made the idea feel not plausible exactly, but familiar, already named, already existing in the cultural imagination as a thing that the culture had already processed and filed under absurdity. And familiarity shapes probability in ways that are not mystical, but are real. When a future feels familiar, when it has been named and categorized and filed away, it encounters less resistance. The cognitive barriers that might otherwise prevent its realization are lower. The disbelief is muted by the memory that the culture already did this joke, already sat with this scenario, already decided how to feel about it. The Simpsons did not predict that Disney would buy Fox. The Simpsons made media consolidation feel inevitable by presenting it as the obvious punchline of an obvious joke. When Disney actually bought Fox, the cultural response was not the kind of shock that accompanies a genuinely unexpected event. It was the dull recognition of something that felt overdue. Of course they did. The Simpsons already did this. The show's satire does not forecast the future. It normalizes the future. It processes trajectories that are already in motion and presents them as accomplished facts. And when those facts eventually materialize, the audience experiences not surprise, but recognition. We have seen this before. The show already did it. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and the audience stared into it long enough that they began to resemble what they saw. The nuclear power plant with the incompetent safety inspector. The corrupt billionaire who owns the economy. The ineffectual government. The population too distracted and too cognitively occupied to notice how comprehensively they are being exploited. The endless cycle of catastrophe followed by collective amnesia and reset. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was headed. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first, and the show will keep writing it down. With 800 episodes as a foundation, with 36 years of satirical content covering every corner of American life, the show has generated enough material that some of it will keep aligning with future events for decades to come. The hits will keep being shared. The misses will keep being forgotten. The highlight reel will keep looking like prophecy, and every time a new clip lines up with a new headline, the same question will circulate. How did they know? They didn't know. They were paying attention. They were extrapolating. They were generating enough material that some of it was going to land. But try telling that to someone who has just watched a clip from 1997 line up perfectly with something that happened this morning. Because the truth is, even knowing how the mechanism works, even understanding the statistical explanation and the confirmation bias and the cultural feedback loop, it is still impressive to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American life, and enough alignments with reality to make even the show's own writers pause occasionally and wonder if they know something they should not. The predictions are not supernatural, but they are not nothing either. They are what happens when a show brilliant enough to see the present clearly enough runs long enough to watch the present become the past and the past become the future again. They are what happens when Springfield never changes and America keeps moving. Eventually, America catches up. Section 10. Ned Flanders and the Cost of Being Good. On the surface, Ned Flanders is the simplest character in Springfield. He is the good neighbor, the patient one, the devout one, the man who extends grace where grace is not deserved, and forgiveness where forgiveness costs him something real. He is, by every external measure, a better person than Homer Simpson. Better father, better neighbor, better citizen, better friend. He does the things a person is supposed to do. He shows up for people. He manages his finances responsibly. He maintains his property. He participates in the community with genuine investment. He treats his faith as something alive rather than as a social credential. He is also, when you look carefully enough, the saddest character in the entire show. Not Homer, who is too cognitively impaired to fully comprehend the architecture of his own suffering, and who therefore moves through his disappointments with a bovine equanimity that functions as a kind of mercy. Not Lisa, who is young enough and idealistic enough to still believe that things might improve, that intelligence and effort and moral clarity might eventually produce the world they deserve to exist in. Not Burns, who is too powerful and too ancient to experience the kind of suffering that comes from powerlessness. Ned Flanders, the man who does everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. The man who is good not because goodness is easy, but because he has been conditioned to be good in a way that removes the alternative, and who lives with the daily evidence that his goodness does not produce the outcomes it is supposed to produce, in a town that has decided that goodness is not a relevant variable in the calculation of what people deserve. Maud Flanders died because of a t-shirt cannon. This detail, delivered with the show's characteristic black absurdity, is actually a precise summary of the show's thesis about Ned. She was sitting in the bleachers at the Springfield Speedway. A cannon was firing promotional t-shirts into the crowd. Homer was in the path of one and dodged aside. The t-shirts that would have hit Homer hit Maud instead. She was knocked from the bleachers and she died. Homer's selfishness killed Ned's wife. Not in a complex or ambiguous way. In a direct, mechanical, cause and effect way. Homer stepped aside and Maud died because Homer stepped aside. And Ned, who knew this, who had access to the same causal chain that anyone watching could trace, responded with forgiveness. Because that is what Ned does. He forgives. He turns the other cheek. He processes rage and grief and injustice through the machinery of his faith and produces grace. But here is what the show revealed about why Ned forgives everything. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it in a way that is structurally so inadequate, it collapses immediately, Ned snaps. The psychological structure that has been containing him breaks open. He stands in the ruins of his house and screams at the people of Springfield, naming each person in the crowd, cataloging the ways they have wronged him, saying the things he has been holding inside for years with a ferocity that the usual Ned voice makes shocking. And then he is institutionalized. In the mental health facility, the show reveals something that reframes everything about this character. Ned's relentless niceness is not natural. It is the result of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, beatniks who rejected conventional discipline on ideological grounds, took him to a psychiatrist when their approach failed to produce results. The psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of Ned through intensive behavioral reprogramming, essentially constructing a psychological cage around the feral child at the center, building a behavioral repertoire of patience and forgiveness, and expressed kindness that would suppress the aggression permanently. It worked. Ned became the nicest man in Springfield. He became the man who forgives everything, who extends grace reflexively, who cannot allow himself to express anger in any sustained way because the conditioning is so deep that anger triggers an immediate override response. His kindness is not a character trait. It is a psychological structure imposed on him before he was old enough to consent to it. His patience is not the product of spiritual maturity or genuine equanimity. It is the product of a doctor who spent years training his nervous system to redirect aggression rather than express it. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. It is the conditioned response of a man whose brain was wired, in childhood, to find an alternative to rage no matter the circumstances and no matter what the circumstances cost him. Every expression of goodness that defines Ned Flanders is the output of a machine that was built around a person rather than a character that person developed freely. And the machine is not infallible, because when the hurricane broke Ned's house, the machine broke too. And what emerged from underneath it was the despair of a man who has spent his entire life being good in a universe that has shown no evidence of caring. His faith is the piece that makes this most uncomfortable to look at directly. Ned is devout in a way that few fictional characters are depicted as devout. His relationship to his faith is not performative. He genuinely believes. He genuinely structures his life around the guidance of a God he trusts to be present and attentive. He prays. He reads scripture. He attends church with regularity and engagement. He treats his faith as a living relationship rather than a social habit, and God never talks to him. In the show's own canonical universe, God is real. God has appeared to Homer in direct conversation, in 2 separate episodes, in a face-to-face context that leaves no ambiguity about the encounter. God spoke to Homer. Homer is the man who sleeps in church, who eats donuts during sermons, who has never demonstrated any consistent or serious religious practice across the entire run of the show. God found this man worth having a conversation with. Ned Flanders, who has spent 36 years of devout, earnest, genuine practice maintaining a living relationship with the God he believes in, has never received that conversation. God talks to Homer. God is silent to Ned. The drunk who nods off during the sermon gets divine attention. The man who has dedicated his life to being worthy of it gets silence. This is not a small detail in the show's construction. This is a thesis statement. The Simpsons is telling you something about how Springfield works. Goodness is not rewarded in this town. Kindness is not protected. Sincere faith is not answered. The system that runs Springfield, whether you identify that system as Burns's empire or the radiation or the floating timeline or the collective mechanisms of denial, does not evaluate moral behavior as a relevant input. It evaluates compliance, and Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield, not because he chose compliance, but because he was programmed for it before he could choose. And his reward for a lifetime of compliance and goodness and patient suffering is a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor who will never appreciate him, and a God who apparently has time for Homer Simpson, but not for the one person in Springfield who is actually listening for an answer. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that does not punish wrongness. He stumbles through disaster after disaster, breaks every rule, fails at every responsibility, and ends each episode back on the couch with his family intact and his life essentially unchanged. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. He maintains every standard, meets every obligation, offers every grace, and ends each episode with the same accumulated grief of a man who has noticed that the calculation does not balance and who has been conditioned not to say so out loud. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, between the person the community would point to as a model and the person the community points to as a joke. That gap has never closed. The show has never allowed it to close, because closing it would require the show to resolve the tension it is built around. The tension between what people are supposed to be rewarded for and what they are actually rewarded for, between the moral architecture that communities claim to operate by and the actual architecture that runs underneath it. Homer's couch exists next to Ned's property line. They share a fence. They share a community. They share the same water and the same radiation and the same yellow sky over the same yellow town. And the distance between them is the distance between everything the show has ever been about. Ned's conditioning is going to hold. The machine will keep running. He will keep forgiving Homer. He will keep maintaining his property. He will keep attending church and praying to a God who has shown no interest in having the conversation with him that he has been asking for across 3 decades of faithful practice. He will keep being the nicest man in Springfield, because he has no other option, because the doctor built the cage before Ned could object, and because in Springfield, the man who can't stop being good is always going to be the one who suffers most visibly. Section 11. Hans Moleman and the Body Count. Hans Moleman is barely a character. He is an old man, very small, nearly blind, with thick glasses that reduce his eyes to the approximate size and expression of punctuation marks. He appears in the background of Springfield scenes. He exists at the margins of stories he is not the center of. He has a name, which the show established in passing, and a stated age, which the show revealed in a throwaway joke, and a tendency to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with a consistency that has no parallel in the show's entire history. And he dies constantly. Not in the Treehouse of Horror anthology episodes, where death is explicitly non-canonical and the show's regular characters are killed for comedic effect without consequence. Not in dream sequences. Not in hypothetical scenarios. In regular episodes. In the main timeline. In the canonical continuity of the show that otherwise treats death as meaningful and permanent, Hans Moleman has been hit by cars. He has been buried alive, more than once, in contexts that left no ambiguity about the finality of the burial. He has been incinerated, he has been eaten by animals, he has been struck by lightning, he has been crushed by falling objects of various kinds. He has walked into traffic and disappeared beneath vehicles. He has experienced every form of accidental death that a small, nearly blind, extremely unlucky man can experience in a community that does not appear to be monitoring his welfare with any consistency. And he keeps showing up. Not after elaborate resurrection scenes, not with any explanation for how he survived what appeared to be unsurvivable. He is simply present in the next episode, back in the background of the Quickie Mart or the Springfield DMV or wherever the episode requires a background body to populate the frame, as if the previous death did not happen, as if the continuity of the show simply declined to register it. The show treats Moleman's death cycle as a recurring gag. He dies a lot. It is funny. Do not think too hard about it. But under the framework of everything we have been discussing, Moleman's repeated deaths are deeply strange. If the radiation theory is true, Moleman represents the most extreme mutation in Springfield. A man whose biology has been so fundamentally altered by chronic nuclear exposure that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. He is not surviving his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Homer endures damage and heals from it, his body repairing the damage through whatever radiation-enhanced biological process the contamination has produced. Moleman actually dies. His body ceases to function in ways that the episodes make visually explicit, and then he returns, not with visible signs of recovery but with a complete reset, as if the death had not occurred, as if the biological slate had been wiped clean. This suggests a mutation that goes further than any other documented in Springfield. Moleman's cellular structure may have been so thoroughly altered by radiation that death is not a permanent state for him. It is a temporary interruption, a shutdown from which his mutated biology can restart, provided the environmental conditions that produce the mutation remain constant. As long as the radiation keeps leaking, as long as the contaminated water supply keeps saturating his tissue, Moleman's cells retain the capacity to reverse the damage that killed him and begin again. He is, in this reading, the furthest point on the mutation spectrum. the most extreme expression of what the power plant has been doing to Springfield's population. Not just compromised biology or enhanced durability, but actual biological resurrection made possible by a degree of radiation-induced cellular modification that the science of the show's universe cannot contain within normal biological categories. And the detail that makes this reading most disturbing is his stated age. In one episode, Malman establishes that he is 31 years old. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s. His body suggests a man who has lived for 8 decades under conditions of considerable physical hardship. The glasses, the stoop, the apparent fragility, the general air of accumulated time, none of these are compatible with a man who is 31 years old, unless something aged him catastrophically. Unless whatever the radiation is doing to Malman is not just enabling his biological resurrection, but is also accelerating his physical aging at a rate that has compressed decades of visible deterioration into a few years of calendar time. He is 31 years old. He looks 85. The gap between those two numbers, between the calendar age and the biological age, is the gap that the radiation theory can fill if you let it. Something took a man in the early years of his life and aged his body dramatically, producing the physical presentation of extreme old age in someone who has not lived long enough to earn that presentation, and then made him nearly indestructible. The same process that aged him catastrophically also made him essentially unkillable. The same radiation that compressed decades of aging into years also gave his cells the capacity to restart after fatal damage. He is simultaneously the most visibly damaged person in Springfield and the only person in Springfield who cannot be permanently killed. The coma theory reads Malman differently, and in a way that is quieter and stranger. If Homer is dreaming, Malman is a background process, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind generates to populate scenes, not because Malman is important to the dream, but because Springfield requires a certain density of human presence to feel like a real place, and a dreaming brain cannot generate and maintain detailed, coherent interior lives for every figure in every scene. Some of the figures are just figures. Some of them are the equivalent of extras on a film set, present because the scene needs bodies, not because the dream has anything invested in them as people. Malman dies because Homer's dreaming brain sometimes lets minor characters lapse. It generates them for a scene, uses them, and then lets the process run down, because maintaining the simulation of a living person requires cognitive resources that a comatose brain in slow deterioration is increasingly reluctant to spend on anyone who is not central to the emotional core of the dream. And then the dream needs him again for another background scene, and the brain regenerates him without the memory of the previous lapse, because memory of minor character consistency is not a high-priority function in a brain that is primarily occupied with keeping Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie present and recognizable and alive in the simulation. Malman is not a person in this reading. He is a prop, a piece of dream furniture that the brain breaks occasionally and reassembles when it is needed, the way a sleeper reassembles the geography of a dream room that shifted while they were not looking at it. The collective denial theory, drawn from the Principal and the Pauper episode, offers the reading that is perhaps the most characteristic of Springfield's operating logic. Malman dies repeatedly, visibly, in public, in front of witnesses, and nobody in Springfield investigates. Nobody calls for accountability. Nobody asks the obvious question about how a man who was crushed by a boulder on Tuesday is working at the DMV on Thursday. The town has normalized Malman's death cycle the same way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming. The three-eyed fish, the glowing billionaire, the principal who isn't who he claims to be, the baby who shot a man, the ice cream that is made from something other than ice cream. None of it gets acknowledged. All of it gets absorbed into the agreed-upon version of Springfield as a place where these things are simply how things are. Malman's deaths are the most visible expression of this normalization. He dies, where people can see it. He comes back without explanation. And Springfield accommodates both events with the same incurious calm that it accommodates everything else. Because acknowledging Malman's death cycle would require acknowledging that death is not working normally in Springfield. And acknowledging that death is not working normally in Springfield would require asking why. And asking why leads back to the power plant, to the radiation, to the water supply, to burns, to the entire architecture of dysfunction that the town has agreed, permanently and collectively, not to examine. So Malman dies. And Molman comes back, and nobody asks how. And Springfield keeps functioning as if the man who got hit by a car yesterday is simply the man who works at the DMV today, with no connection between the two events worth examining or explaining or registering in any way that might require the community to do something about it. The body count accumulates in the background. Nobody maintains it. Nobody files a report. Nobody connects the dots. Because in Springfield, connecting the dots is the one thing the infrastructure was built to prevent. Section 12. The floating timeline, why we won't let them go. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1 then. She is 1 now. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s then. They still are. 36 years have passed in the world outside Springfield. 0 years have passed inside it. The characters exist in a permanent present tense, locked at the ages they were when the show began, cycling through an endless contemporary moment that is always now and was always now and will always be now. However many actual years accumulate on the other side of the television screen. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. The show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. The year changes, the cultural references change, the technology visible in the background changes. The jokes reference whatever is current in the world, but the characters do not change. They do not age. They do not accumulate the evidence of time passing in the way that living things accumulate it. They exist outside of time while living inside of every moment of it. Most long-running animated shows use this device. Most viewers accept it without examination because the alternative, aging animated characters across decades of episodes creates its own set of problems. The floating timeline is a practical solution to a production challenge. It is not inherently mysterious. It is simply how these shows work. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has started to crack under its own weight. The contradictions it produces have grown so massive that they have begun to destabilize the show's internal logic in ways that cannot be attributed to simple production convention. The most obvious problem is the backstory. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was grounded in the 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love in that era. Their courtship was defined by the cultural textures of that specific period. The music, the fashion, the social context of a particular American decade. Their origin story had temporal specificity. It was anchored to a time that made sense for people who were in their mid-30s during the late 1980s. As the floating timeline dragged the show's present forward, the backstory had to drag with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in 1980. They met in approximately 2005. Which means their high school experience was defined not by Watergate and disco and the particular flavor of late 70s American anxiety, but by MySpace and the early internet and the cultural landscape of the mid-2000s. The show has made this adjustment explicitly across multiple flashback episodes. Homer and Marge have had their youth rewritten several times over the course of the show's run. Each version places their formative years in a different decade. They were shaped by the 70s, then the 80s, then the 90s, then the 2000s. The love story remains the same. The characters remain the same. The specific cultural era in which they fell in love has been updated multiple times. This means that Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. Their history is not stable. It is a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of a permanent present. Their memories are unstable in a structural sense. Their origin story is not a fact about them, but a production convenience that is adjusted whenever the gap between the story's present and its character's apparent age becomes too awkward to sustain. Apply the theories to this, and every single one arrives at the same place through a different path. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man who went to sleep in April 1993. His brain cannot produce an older version of his children because he has no template for it. His memory of them is fixed at the moment of the coma, and the dream plays that memory forward in time without allowing the characters to age, because aging would require reference material that does not exist in his memory banks. The radiation theory says nobody ages because their biology has been mutated by decades of nuclear contamination at a cellular level that has disrupted the normal aging process. The same exposure that gave Homer superhuman physical resilience and four fingers and yellow skin has also altered the cellular mechanisms of senescence, producing a population that exists in a state of biological stasis, aging without appearing to age, alive without the visible evidence of accumulated time. The principle and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield has voted, collectively and permanently, to ignore anything that threatens the status quo, and aging is the most fundamental threat to the status quo imaginable. Aging means change. Change means the town is different from what it agreed to be. And the agreement, the deep structural agreement that runs beneath all of Springfield's social contracts, is that things stay the same. The principal is Skinner. Homer works at the plant. The kids are 10 and 8. The beer is cold. The couch is occupied. Nothing changes. The Burns immortality theory notes that at least one person in Springfield has already demonstrated that biological aging is a negotiable variable, that the normal trajectory of a human lifespan can be interrupted through sufficient technological and financial investment, and that therefore the concept of aging is already operating differently in this universe than it operates in ours. If Burns can live past 140 through weekly radiation treatments and a pharmaceutical infrastructure maintained by the most powerful private wealth in American history, then the concept of aging in Springfield has already been revealed as contingent rather than absolute. And the prediction theory says The Simpsons exists in a feedback loop with American culture so deep and so persistent that the boundary between what the show depicts and what the culture becomes has been functionally dissolved. Springfield does not reflect America. America reflects Springfield. The floating timeline is not just a production device. It is the show's ongoing demonstration that the American family, as it exists in the cultural imagination, is frozen. It cannot be allowed to age because aging means the show ends, and the show ending means releasing the version of the American family that the show represents. The messy and loving and infuriating and resilient family that has been sitting on that couch since 1989 into a future that will require them to grow and change and eventually let go. And we are not ready for that. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done so multiple times. In flash-forward episodes that depict Lisa as a young woman, Bart as an adult, Homer and Marge in the later years of their marriage. These futures exist within the show's universe as acknowledged possibilities. The show knows what it would look like if time passed. It knows what these people would become. Season 6's Lisa's Wedding is one of the most emotionally rich episodes in the show's history, precisely because it shows Lisa grown up and in love and struggling with the same tensions that defined her childhood. The longing for connection in a world that finds her too much and not enough simultaneously. The episode proves that the show can imagine its characters as adults. It can tell stories about who they would become if the clock were allowed to move, but it chooses not to. The flash forward is always a single episode, a glimpse through a window that closes immediately. Lisa returns to being 8. Bart returns to being 10. The future is locked away and the permanent present resumes, as if the glimpse were a warning rather than a promise. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. This is where the mystery becomes something larger than The Simpsons. The floating timeline is not just a narrative device. It is a statement about America. About what Americans need the American family to be. About the specific kind of preservation that a culture requires when the thing it is preserving represents something it cannot bear to see change. Homer must always be middle-aged. Marge must always be patient. Bart must always be rebellious. Lisa must always be brilliant and isolated and still fighting. Maggie must always be silent, watching, waiting. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpson family ages, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves to a city that appreciates her, and Maggie begins to speak, and Homer retires, and Marge is left in an empty house on Evergreen Terrace, the show stops being a comedy. It becomes an elegy. It becomes the story of a family that ran out of time. That grew up and grew apart in the way that all families eventually grow up and grow apart, losing the specific gravity of the household that held them together, dispersing into individual lives that are connected by memory and obligation but no longer by daily proximity. And America does not want that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young, where the parents are always together and visibly in love, bickering and reconciling in the eternal rhythm of a marriage that has been going for 36 years without arriving at any destination, where the house always smells the same and the television always plays and Homer always comes through the door at 5:30 muttering about his day and Marge always has something warm and the couch always accepts all of them at once, cozy and present and unchanged. The floating timeline is the show's thesis. The Simpsons is frozen in time because we need it to be frozen, because it represents something we cannot afford to let go of. Not because the show is particularly realistic, it never was, but because what it represents, the indestructible, dysfunctional, genuinely loving American family, is a thing that the culture reached for in 1989 and never stopped reaching for. The loop is not their prison. The loop is ours. We built it. We maintain it every week when we tune in and watch the same family in the same house, in the same impossible town. We tighten it with every episode we watch, every quote we memorize, every time we reference something from a season that aired before most of us were adults, as if it happened to people we know. We are the reason Bart is still 10. We are the reason Lisa is still 8. We pressed pause in 1989, and we have been holding the button ever since. And every theory in this video, every thread we have pulled and followed to its end, the radiation and the coma and the murder mystery and the immortal billionaire and the silenced principal and the unfindable town and the predicted futures and the programmed neighbor and the repeatedly dying background character, all of it converges here. All of it points to this. A family frozen in time because the people watching them need them frozen. A town that cannot change because the people who live in it cannot afford to change, and the people watching it cannot afford to let it. The Simpsons are trapped in a loop because we trapped them there, and the loop is a perfect circle. We watch because they don't change. They don't change because we watch. Round and round, 36 years. An endless Sunday night in Springfield with the television on and the family together and nothing permanently wrong. Time stopped in Springfield because we stopped it. We pressed pause in December of 1989, and we never pressed play. And now here we are, decades later, watching the same family in the same house, waiting for something to change while knowing, at the level of the thing we know before we know it, that nothing will, because we won't let it. And that, when you trace every theory back to its source and follow every thread to its end, is the real mystery of The Simpsons. Not the radiation, not the coma. Not the unsolved shooting or the immortal billionaire or the unfindable geography or the eerie predictions. The real mystery is why 36 years later, with every thread visible and every mechanism exposed and every impossible thing about Springfield available for examination, we still come back. Why we still need them there. Why the couch matters. Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is our town and Homer is our father and Marge is our mother and Bart is who we wanted to be when we were young enough that wanting felt uncomplicated, and Lisa is who we should have been if we had been brave enough and lonely enough to keep asking questions after the community told us to stop. And Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden behind the pacifier, the part that watches everything and says nothing and waits for the right moment that never quite arrives. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe we come back because coming back means not admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the world we grew up in is different in ways that we cannot fully name, that the couch we sat on as children, watching the opening credits with the music playing and the family tumbling through the door from their respective days, is somewhere else now, someone else's couch, or no one's couch, or a piece of furniture that a person we once were sat on in a room that no longer exists. As long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the timeline keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant, we do not have to admit any of that. We can sit down, we can put on the television, and we can go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield. To the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends, the theories do not ruin Springfield. They make Springfield make sense. They take 36 years of impossible accumulation and find the pattern underneath, the logic that runs beneath the jokes, the story the show has been telling in the margins and the background and the throwaway lines and the 2-second visual gags that would require pausing the frame to catch. The show is not hiding its mysteries. It has been showing them to you every single week for 36 years. In the yellow skin, in the cracked cooling tower, in the three-eyed fish, in the sundial, in the empty gun holster, in the final shot of a baby checking that she is alone before moving her pacifier like a trigger, in the decree that makes it illegal to speak the truth, in the town that floats between states, in the man who glows in the dark after his weekly appointment, in the woman who kissed her son goodbye in the dark in 1969 and never stopped running from the man who made her. It has all been there, all of it. In plain sight, dressed in jokes, wrapped in the particular warmth of a show that loves its characters even as it builds the case for everything that went wrong with them and the town that made them. That is the dark truth of The Simpsons. And it is not darkness for its own sake. It is darkness in the service of something true. A show that has spent 36 years telling you, through every available register of comedy and absurdity and occasional devastating sincerity, that the American family is resilient and broken and yellow and beloved and poisoned and indestructible and aging without appearing to age and sitting on the same couch and watching the same television in the same house on the same street in the same impossible town, that it has survived everything and forgotten everything and reset after everything, not because nothing mattered, but because some things matter too much to lose. That Homer Simpson, wherever he actually is, whatever version of consciousness he is occupying in whatever room he is dreaming about his family. And the dream is beautiful. And the dream is enough. And the loop keeps floating. And Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If this story settled somewhere in you, leave a comment. If you want more nights like this, subscribe, and there will be more nights like this. Sleep well. The show is still on. The family is still there. The couch still has room. End of script. Total approximate word count to 43,500 words. Extended section. The deeper architecture of Burns's empire. There is a version of Charles Montgomery Burns that the show presents most of the time. The cartoon version. The man who cannot remember his employee's name despite that employee working for him for over 2 decades. The man who refers to technologies that have been obsolete for 50 years as though they are current innovations. The man whose physical frailty is played for comic effect, whose claw-like hands and hunched posture and occasional bouts of near death are presented as visual jokes rather than as evidence of anything. This version of Burns is funny. It is designed to be funny. It has been funny for 36 years. But there is another version of Burns that lives underneath the joke version, assembled from the details the show provides when it is not trying to make you laugh, and this other version is one of the most carefully constructed characters in the history of American television. Because Burns, when you look at all of it together, is not a cartoon villain. He is a study in what power looks like when it has been accumulating across more than a century without anything capable of stopping it. Consider the geographic reach of his influence. The show has established, across dozens of episodes, that Burns's power is not limited to the nuclear plant or even to Springfield's economy. He has connections to federal law enforcement, demonstrated clearly in his ability to mobilize the FBI against Mona Simpson on the basis of what amounted to a personal grievance. He has connections to the municipal judiciary, demonstrated in The Principal and the Pauper, through the ease with which a legal decree was arranged to protect an imposter at his implied benefit. He has connections to Springfield's regulatory infrastructure, demonstrated through the sustained absence of any effective enforcement response to 342 documented safety violations. He has connections to the medical establishment. His own physicians operated within a framework that existed entirely outside the reach of normal medical oversight. He has connections to the political system, demonstrated across multiple episodes depicting his influence over local and occasionally state-level governance. This is not a man who happened to get rich. This is a man who built an infrastructure of influence across every institution capable of checking his power, and then maintained that infrastructure for over a century while the institutions themselves changed around it. The people in those institutions change. The people who understood the original arrangements retire or die. But the arrangements persist, because arrangements of the kind Burns builds are not personal relationships. They are structural dependencies, encoded into the functioning of institutions in ways that survive the departure of any individual. Burns understands something about power that most powerful people understand too late, if they understand it at all. Power is not a thing you possess, it is a thing you construct. And the constructions that last are the ones that make themselves necessary to the continued functioning of the systems they are embedded in. Burns has made himself necessary to Springfield. His plant provides the town's electricity, his employment provides the town's economy, his tax payments provide the town's municipal budget. The town cannot remove him without collapsing the systems that depend on him, which means the town is not governed by Burns so much as it is architected around him, built in a shape that his presence defines and that his absence would destroy. This is why the three-eyed fish goes nowhere. This is why the 432 violations go unaddressed. This is why the biological weapons laboratory existed in a residential area for years without any regulatory response. It is not that Springfield's institutions are too incompetent to respond to these things. Some of them are incompetent. Chief Wiggum is demonstrably not the most effective law enforcement presence in American fiction. But incompetence alone does not explain the complete absence of any institutional response to decades of documented environmental destruction. The absence is too complete, too consistent, too total to be explained by individual failures. It is explained by structure, by the fact that the structures that might respond have been shaped over time by the presence and influence of the thing they should be responding to. Burns's shadow falls across every institution in Springfield, and the shadow has been there long enough that the institutions have grown into it the way plants grow toward their available light, bending themselves into configurations that accommodate the shadow rather than challenging it. The biological weapons facility is the piece that most clearly reveals the full scope of this. The show introduces it in the context of Mona Simpson's backstory, and then largely leaves it alone, treating it as backstory rather than ongoing plot. But the existence of that facility raises questions that the show never answers and perhaps never intends to answer. Who are the clients? Who commissioned the weapons that the facility was producing? What arrangements existed between Burns and whatever governmental or private entities were purchasing access to biological weapons manufactured in a residential area of a mid-sized American town? What regulatory frameworks were being violated, and how were those violations being suppressed? And how, in any environment where regulatory oversight was functioning at any level above zero, could such a facility have operated long enough for an activist group to form, plan a raid, and execute an antibiotic bomb inside it? The answer is that the regulatory oversight was not functioning. It was not functioning because Burns had spent decades ensuring that it would not function, not through direct corruption in every case, though direct corruption plays a documented role in the show's universe, but through the structural dependency that his plant's economic importance created. You do not regulate the institution that the town's survival depends on, because regulating it risks disrupting it, and disrupting it risks the collapse of everything the town has built around it. This is the fundamental trap that Burns has built for Springfield, and it is a trap so elegantly constructed that the people inside it cannot see the walls. They experience it only as the familiar landscape of their lives. The plant is there. It has always been there. The lights come on when they flip the switch. Homer drives to work every morning. Burns's name appears on the municipal tax rolls. The economy functions in its constrained and Burns-dependent way. And all of this normalcy is the trap, because it creates the conditions in which challenging Burns feels not only dangerous but actively irrational, a choice to disrupt something that is working in favor of an uncertain alternative that may not work at all. Springfield cannot rebel against Burns, not because its population lacks courage or intelligence, because the town has been built in a shape that rebellion would destroy, and Burns has been building that shape for over 100 years. This is empire, not the heroic kind that gets statues and holidays. The real kind, the kind that looks like ordinary economic life until you step back far enough to see the whole shape, and by then you have been living inside it long enough that it is simply the world. The immortality is the capstone of this. Because an empire maintained by a single individual requires that individual to keep operating. Normal empires have succession plans. Normal empires survive the deaths of their founders by transferring power to institutions, to legal structures, to corporate entities that outlast any individual. Burns has done some of this. His corporation exists. His legal arrangements are extensive. The structural dependencies he has created would survive his death in some form. But Burns himself is the architecture. His century of accumulated relationships, his institutional knowledge, his personal history with every arrangement that keeps the system functioning, none of that transfers cleanly to a successor. The specific leverage that Burns holds over specific institutions depends on his personal history with those institutions, on the original arrangements and the original silences and the original deals that he brokered himself and has maintained himself across decades. A successor would inherit a corporation, but not the architecture of influence that gives the corporation its real power. So Burns cannot die. The empire cannot afford for him to die. The empire has therefore engineered his survival, not because he is irreplaceable in any philosophical sense, not because his soul or his vision cannot be succeeded by another, but because the specific machinery of influence that runs the empire requires him specifically, and the machinery has therefore devoted a portion of its resources to keeping the operator alive. The weekly treatments are not just Burns being cared for by his employees. The weekly treatments are the empire maintaining its own operational continuity by maintaining the operational continuity of its most irreplaceable component. Burns is the reactor, and the treatments are how the empire keeps the reactor running, because the alternative, letting the reactor fail, would cause a cascade that the empire's current infrastructure is not built to survive. Everything else follows from this. Homer's employment, Grandpa's silence, Mona's exile, the three-eyed fish swimming in the river, the yellow skin on every face in town, the four fingers on every hand, the cracked cooling towers visible from the elementary school, the sundial in the town square, the pacifier in the baby's mouth. The agreement, ratified by collective silence across 36 years, that the man who glows in the dark is simply the man who employs you, and that is all he is, and nothing else about him requires examination. That is Charles Montgomery Burns. That is what power looks like when it has been building for 140 years in the same town. Not evil in any theatrical sense, just comprehensive, just present everywhere that matters, just so woven into the fabric of the community that removing him would remove the community along with him. Springfield and Burns are the same thing. The town is his body, and he is the town's electricity, and neither can exist without the other. And that, more than any individual act of cruelty, is what makes him the most frightening character the show has ever created. Not what he does, what he is, what the town has become around him, what the people inside the contamination zone have become inside the shape that his influence built. They are his population. They have always been his population. They are just the last ones to know it. Extended section. The emotional logic of the coma. There is a specific quality to the Homer coma theory that separates it from every other theory about The Simpsons, and that quality is grief. Most theories about the show are analytical. They examine evidence, propose mechanisms, construct logical frameworks for explaining the show's internal inconsistencies. The radiation theory is essentially a conspiracy theory with biological evidence. The Burns immortality theory is a character study wrapped in medical speculation. The geographic theory is an analysis of the show's deliberate self-contradiction. The coma theory is a love story. And that is why it stays with you in a way the others do not. Because if Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then every episode of the show is not a story about Homer. Every episode is a story about what Homer misses. Every storyline, however absurd, however far removed from the grounded domestic comedy of the early seasons, is Homer's unconscious mind attempting to produce the thing it wants most, which is the experience of being present for his family's life. Of being there? Of being in the house and at the table and on the couch, watching television and eating donuts and having arguments that resolve themselves before bedtime, and waking up the next morning to the same family in the same house with the same opportunities to do it all over again. The escalating absurdity of later seasons, Homer in space, Homer meeting the president, Homer traveling to dozens of countries, Homer joining secret societies and vigilante groups and rock bands and professional bowling circuits, all of it reads differently through this lens. It is not the writers running out of domestic stories to tell. It is a dreaming brain that has been in a coma long enough to exhaust its reference material. The early dream was grounded because the early dream had source material, the actual lived memories of Homer's pre-coma life in Springfield, domestic and recognizable and emotionally specific. As the coma extends and the brain deteriorates, the dream's grounding loosens. The dream becomes more extravagant because the memories that anchored it to recognizable reality are fading. The brain is running out of the specific material it needs to generate a coherent domestic simulation, and it is compensating by pulling from less specific, more culturally ambient sources. From television, from celebrity, from the fragmentary cultural noise that filters through the hospital room into the unconscious mind of a man who is no longer keeping his own memories in good repair. The celebrity appearances mark this trajectory precisely. Early Homer, pre-coma Homer, interacts with people who are part of his actual life, his family, his neighbors, his coworkers, his boss. The ordinary human infrastructure of a life lived in a specific place among specific people. The Dream Homer, the post-season 4 Homer, begins interacting with celebrities at a rate that accelerates as the seasons progress. He meets famous musicians and actors and athletes. He encounters presidents and world leaders. He travels to places that his pre-coma self would never have had occasion to visit. The dream is supplementing its failing domestic database with ambient cultural material, and the culture that Homer is absorbing through the hospital room's ambient media is the culture of the 1990s and 2000s, a culture unusually saturated with celebrity. The hospital television is on, the radio is playing. The nurses are talking about things they saw and heard and read. And Homer's dreaming brain, working with the material available to it, incorporates these inputs into the simulation, producing a Springfield that becomes increasingly populated with famous people and increasingly disconnected from the recognizable domestic reality that the early seasons established. The dream is leaking. It is absorbing the outside world because the inside world is running thin. And somewhere in the middle of all of this escalation, somewhere in the increasingly unmoored fantasy of the later seasons, the emotional core of the dream remains constant. Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Whatever adventure the simulation has generated, however far it has taken him from Evergreen Terrace, the episode ends with him back in the house, back on the couch, back with the family. The reset is not narrative laziness. The reset is the dream's primary function. The dream is not about the adventures. The adventures are the dream's way of killing time while it waits to produce the thing it is actually for, which is the moment when Homer comes home and Marge is there, and Bart is there, and Lisa is playing her saxophone, and Maggie is in her high chair, and the family is intact and present and alive. That moment is what the dream is protecting. That is the thing the coma has been built to preserve, not the nuclear plant or the bowling alley or the donut jokes. The family on the couch. The specific, ordinary, irreplaceable fact of the family on the couch. Homer cannot imagine his children growing up because growing up means they will leave. It means Bart will eventually be too old for the pranks and the mischief and the complicated, combative love between a father and a son who are more similar than either would admit. It means Lisa will outgrow Springfield, will find a world that is large enough for her intelligence and her ambition and her need for connection, and that world will not be in the house on Evergreen Terrace. It means Maggie will stop being the baby, will eventually need the pacifier less, will develop the language and the mobility and the independence that babies develop into children, and children develop into people who do not need their parents in the same way that babies do. Homer cannot imagine any of this because imagining it means imagining a version of the family that does not need him at the center of it. And the one thing the dream cannot produce is a version of the family that does not need Homer, because that version would mean the dream was over. It would mean there was nothing left for the coma to protect. It would mean Homer could wake up and face whatever the real world has become in the years since April 1993. So the children stay young, so the house stays the same. So the loop keeps floating, and the family keeps assembling on the couch, and Homer keeps stumbling through the door at 5:30, because in the dream, 5:30 is always approaching, and Homer is always on his way home, and the family is always there when he arrives. The dream is not a nightmare. The dream is a gift. It is the only heaven that makes sense for a man whose deepest wish is the simplest wish a person can have. Not glory or success or fame or the resolution of every old grievance. Just the family, intact, present, alive, at home on Evergreen Terrace with the television on and the beer cold and nobody going anywhere. That is what the coma protects. That is what 36 years of floating timeline has been built to preserve. And when you understand that, when you feel the weight of it rather than just noting it intellectually, the show stops being a collection of increasingly elaborate cartoon adventures and starts being something else entirely. It starts being a testament. A 36-year testament to the thing that matters most to a man who is sleeping in a hospital bed in a town that may or may not be able to be found on a map, dreaming the same dream over and over because the dream is the closest thing to home that he has left. Every time you watch The Simpsons, you are watching Homer dream about his family. Every single episode, every single one of them. And knowing that does not make the show sadder. It makes it more beautiful. Because it means every donut joke and every strangling gag and every absurd adventure and every moment where the family is together on that couch and the credits roll and everything is fine, every single moment is Homer holding on, refusing to let go, dreaming them alive. Extended section. What Lisa knows. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. She has been brilliant for all of them, and she has been paying for her brilliance in the specific coin that Springfield charges for intelligence, which is isolation and dismissal, and the particular loneliness of being the smartest person in a room that does not want to be smart. We have talked about Maggie's silence and the strategic intelligence underneath it. But Lisa's visibility deserves its own careful examination, because Lisa is the character who sees most clearly what Springfield is and cannot look away from what she sees, and the cost of that clarity is something the show has been measuring across decades of episodes with a consistency that is one of the most honest things it has ever done. Lisa knows about the radiation. She does not connect it to the specific mechanism that the radiation theory proposes, does not have the full picture of Burns's century-long experiment on the town's population, but she is the character who notices the three-eyed fish and takes it seriously. She is the character who pursues environmental injustice in Springfield when everyone around her has already decided to accept it. She is the character who keeps filing the reports and writing the papers and raising her hand in the back of the room to note that the water quality data indicates something is wrong, even after years of watching those efforts produce nothing. She knows about the power plant's failures. She is the one Simpson child who has consistently registered the plant not as background noise but as an active problem with active consequences. She does not have Homer's emotional investment in the job, does not have the psychological dependency that makes Homer incapable of examining his own employment critically. She can look at the cooling towers and see them clearly. She just cannot make anyone else look with her for long enough to matter. She knows about Burns. She understands the architecture of his influence over Springfield in ways that the show has never required her to articulate directly, but that are visible in how she responds to episodes that involve him. She does not harbor Homer's complicated emotional investment in Burns's opinion. She does not have Bart's ability to treat everything as an opportunity for a prank rather than a situation requiring analysis. She looks at Burns and she sees what he is, accurately, and she knows there is nothing she can do about it, and she carries that knowledge in the particular way that intelligent children carry knowledge that they cannot use. This is Lisa's specific tragedy. Not that she is smart in a world that does not value intelligence, though that is part of it. The deeper tragedy is that she is smart enough to see the problem clearly and old enough to understand the constraints, but not powerful enough to act on what she understands. She is permanently in the position of the person who has diagnosed the illness correctly and cannot get anyone to agree to the treatment. She can explain exactly what is wrong with Springfield, with the plant, with Burns, with the collective mechanisms of denial that keep the town in its comfortable, contaminated stasis. She can make the case with evidence and logic, and the particular articulate passion of a child who has not yet learned to calibrate her expectations to what the world is prepared to hear. And the world keeps telling her to quiet down, to be realistic, to focus on her schoolwork, to understand that some things are the way they are and that accepting them is not the same as approving of them. The show has given Lisa moments where she wins, where her intelligence and her persistence produce the outcome she was working toward. These moments are not nothing. They are real, and the show honors them, and they matter to the character's ongoing journey. But they are always moments, always localized victories in a larger war that she is perpetually losing, and the show is honest about this in ways that most shows about child characters are not. Lisa keeps fighting, and Springfield keeps resetting. And the next episode begins with the same plant still leaking, and the same fish still swimming with three eyes, and the same collective amnesia settling over the town like radiation-saturated fog. She is 8 years old, and she has been fighting this battle for 36 years. The show's most emotionally devastating episodes are the ones that allow Lisa to be right, to be completely and demonstrably correct, and to watch that correctness produce nothing that the next episode will remember. Because those episodes are not about Lisa failing. They are about the system being designed to absorb the efforts of people like Lisa without being changed by them. They are about the specific exhaustion of being permanently right in a context that has decided rightness is not a relevant variable. Maggie watched this and chose silence. Lisa watches it and cannot choose silence, cannot make herself smaller, cannot calibrate down to what Springfield will tolerate. She keeps being exactly as large as she is, and Springfield keeps being exactly as small as it is, and the gap between them is the gap that the show has been measuring since the beginning. It will never close. The show will not allow it to close, because the gap is one of the things the show is about. It is the gap between what people like Lisa want the world to be and what the world that made them has decided to be. And it is real, and it is not comfortable. And the show has been sitting with it for 36 years without resolving it. Because resolving it would mean lying about how the gap works, about what it costs, about what it does to the person who keeps showing up to fight it, year after year, episode after episode, 8 years old and brilliant and alone. Lisa Simpson is the show's conscience, and Springfield has been testing whether a conscience is enough for 36 seasons. The answer has always been the same. It is not. But she keeps showing up anyway, and the show keeps letting her. And that, in its way, is the most hopeful thing in Springfield. Not that Lisa will win, but that she does not stop. Not because she is naive. She is the least naive person in Springfield. But because she has decided, somewhere in the part of herself that the show never quite names, that showing up is its own answer. That the act of continuing to see clearly in a town that has voted to see nothing is not futile, even when it produces no measurable outcome. That some things are worth doing not because they will succeed, but because they are worth doing. Springfield is a contamination zone, and the residents are symptomatic, and the billionaire at the top of the hill has been keeping everyone just impaired enough to avoid asking the questions that would bring the whole structure down. And Lisa keeps asking them anyway, from the back of every room, with her hand raised, with the evidence prepared, with the argument ready, with the patience of someone who has been doing this for 36 years and has not yet run out of reasons to continue. 8 years old. Brilliant. Alone. Still asking. Extended section. The sounds of Springfield? There is a quality to The Simpsons that is not visual and not narrative. It is auditory. The sound of Springfield, the ambient texture of the world the show has built, is one of the most carefully constructed elements of its 36-year run. And it carries the same patterns of dark truth that the visual and narrative elements carry, embedded in the texture of the place rather than in any specific story or character. The sound of the plant is always present. Not always audible as a distinct element, not always foregrounded in the mix, but always there in episodes that take place near or within the facility, a low industrial hum that the show uses to establish location and that has become, over decades of repetition, one of the most immediately recognizable sounds in American television. That hum is the sound of the reactor. It is the sound of the power that keeps Springfield's lights on and the sound of the radiation that keeps Springfield's population impaired. The show has put that sound in the background of enough scenes that viewers no longer consciously register it. It is simply part of the texture of Springfield, as natural and unremarkable as the yellow sky or the four fingers, or the smell that Bart once described with a specificity that the show immediately dropped and moved on from. The sound of Homer's work, the particular rhythm of his day at the plant, is also carefully constructed. The sounds of his button pressing, of his workstation's alerts, of the various industrial noises that accompany his daily performance of a job he does not understand and has never done competently. These sounds have been consistent across decades, creating an auditory through line for Homer's employment that is as specific and recognizable as any visual element of the show. The sounds of Sector 7G are the sounds of a man failing at his job in exactly the same way, every day, for over 30 years. They are the sounds of a safety system that is not being maintained, of an alert system whose alerts are being ignored, of a man who fell asleep in front of his console again and will wake up in time for his donut. The sound of Burns' voice is one of the show's most distinctive audio achievements. Harry Shearer's performance as Burns creates a voice that is immediately legible as both ancient and active. A voice that belongs to someone who has been speaking for a very long time and has learned, across that time, to put exactly the right amount of weight on exactly the right words. It is a voice that carries authority not through volume or aggression, but through the particular quality of someone who has never had to raise their voice, because the people around them have always been listening, because the alternative to listening was always something worse than listening. Burns's voice is the sound of power that has been held so long it no longer needs to announce itself. It simply is. Marge's voice has its own quality. The particular texture of restrained patience that Anne Mira developed for the character and that has been maintained across decades by Julie Kavner. It is the voice of someone who has been managing this household and this marriage and this community for 36 years, and who has found ways to keep doing it without being broken by the effort, which is its own kind of strength and its own kind of cost. There is something in the HM that Marge makes, that specific vocalization that expresses concern and doubt and patient observation without committing to any of them, that carries more information than most television characters communicate in complete sentences. The HM is the sound of Marge watching Springfield and understanding it, and deciding, repeatedly and perpetually, that managing it is more productive than fighting it. That the household will survive if she keeps it standing. That the family will hold together if she keeps holding it. That the town can be lived in even if it cannot be fixed. And then there is the couch gag music. The specific piece of music that plays over the opening sequence, that has been playing over the opening sequence since 1989, that generations of viewers have heard so many times that it lives not in memory but in the body, activating something reflexive and automatic and completely bypassed by any conscious decision-making process. The music does not remind viewers of The Simpsons. It is The Simpsons, in a more fundamental sense than the visual elements, because the visual elements change with each couch gag while the music remains constant. The music is the one unchanging thing in Springfield. Everything else has been altered by radiation or coma, or collective denial, or the floating timeline, or Burns's 100 years of influence. The music plays the same way it always has. That music is what 36 years of the same family sounds like. It is the sound of the loop. It is the sound of time not passing. It is the sound of us pressing pause in December of 1989 and holding it there, and holding it there, and holding it there, while the world outside keeps moving and Springfield stays exactly where it is, frozen and yellow and familiar and always, always home. Extended section: What the town votes for. The vote in The Principal and the Pauper is Springfield's most honest moment. Not because it is the most dramatic moment, or the most emotionally resonant, or the most thematically complex, but because it is the moment where the show's operating logic becomes explicit in a way that every other episode leaves implicit. The machinery of Springfield's collective denial is usually invisible. It operates in the white space between episodes, in the absence of any acknowledgement that the previous episode's catastrophe happened, in the smooth resumption of normalcy that the floating timeline enables without ever quite explaining. The machinery is there, running constantly, but you only see its output, not its mechanism. The vote is the mechanism. And what the mechanism reveals, when you watch it operate in real time, is something that the show has been depicting in indirect ways since the beginning, but has never said quite this directly. Springfield's amnesia is chosen. It is not a symptom of radiation damage, though the radiation has certainly made it easier. It is not the automatic reset of an unconscious dreaming brain, though the coma theory can accommodate it within that framework. It is a decision, made collectively, ratified by public vote, and enforced by the judiciary of a community that has decided that the truth is a threat to its continued existence. This is the thing that the episode's critics could not metabolize. Not the implausibility of an imposter maintaining a stolen identity for 20 years, not the absurdity of a legal decree making it illegal to speak a specific truth, not even the exile of the real Skinner on a railroad car. What the critics could not metabolize was the accuracy of it. The episode showed them something true about how communities function, and they wanted it to be bad writing because bad writing is something you can dismiss, and this was not something that could be dismissed. Communities choose to believe convenient things. Communities vote, implicitly or explicitly, to maintain the version of reality that allows them to continue functioning. The version that does not require anyone to do anything costly or difficult or uncomfortable. The version that keeps the economy stable and the social order intact, and the most powerful person in town from having any reason to deploy the leverage they have been accumulating for 100 years against the people who depend on them. Springfield voted for Tamzarian over Skinner because Tamzarian is the principal they know and Skinner is the principal they don't. Because accepting Skinner would require acknowledging that everything they thought they knew about their school's leadership was wrong. Because the cost of truth in this case is the disruption of a stable, familiar, functional lie. And disruption is expensive, and truth is free. But the bill for truth in Springfield always comes due in ways that the community has decided it cannot afford to pay. Apply this logic to the radiation. Springfield knows at some level that something is wrong. The three-eyed fish was national news. The EPA dome sealed their town. The safety violations have been documented in numbers large enough that their absence from public consciousness represents a deliberate choice not to remember them rather than an inability to know. Springfield has all the information it needs to understand what the power plant is doing to it. What it lacks is not information. What it lacks is the willingness to act on that information. Because acting on it would require confronting Burns, and confronting Burns would collapse the economic structure that the town depends on, and the economic collapse would be felt by every person in Springfield in ways that are immediate and painful and personal, while the radiation damage is slow and invisible and distributed across every yellow face in town in ways that any individual can attribute to their own particular version of normal. So, the town votes for the radiation. Not in a formal meeting with a show of hands and a legal decree, but in the same way that the town voted for Tamzarian, through the collective, silent, ongoing decision to accept the world as it is, rather than to act on the knowledge of what the world actually contains. Every time a Springfield resident drinks the water and does not mention the taste. Every time a parent notices their child's yellow skin and decides this is simply what children look like. Every time someone drives past the cooling towers on the way to work and thinks nothing particular about the crack in the concrete or the chemical smell in the morning air. Every time the local news broadcasts something about the plant and the broadcast is received with the same mild interest that any local news receives, before the channel changes and dinner is ready and the children need to be called to the table. These are all votes. They are all decisions, made individually and then aggregated into the collective choice that Springfield makes every day. To accept Burns's Springfield as the only Springfield available, to treat the contamination as the condition of normal life, to agree, silently and without meeting, that the truth of what the plant has done to the town is not a truth that can be acted on, and that therefore it is a truth that will not be acknowledged. Judge Snyder's decree is just the formal expression of an informal arrangement that has been in place since Burns opened the plant. It makes explicit what the town had always understood implicitly. The truth is welcome here only when it costs nothing. When it costs something, the truth must be managed. And the management of truth in Springfield has always followed the same protocol. Acknowledge it just enough to indicate you are aware of it, and then vote to ensure that awareness produces no consequences. The real Seymour Skinner understood this. That is why he accepted his exile without mounting a sustained campaign to reclaim his identity. Because he had lived in the world long enough to know that a community that has voted to exile the truth does not vote again simply because the truth is still present. The decree was not just a legal document. It was a statement of community values. And the community's values, stated clearly in the meeting where the vote was held, were that comfort and familiarity and the continued functioning of a system built on a lie were worth more than the disruption and the accountability and the uncomfortable reckoning that the truth would require. He knew this. He got on the train. He went wherever the train went. And Springfield went back to normal. Because normal in Springfield is not a state of affairs. It is a decision. One that has been made, renewed, and reaffirmed across 36 years of episodes, each one ending with the same quiet return to the same house on the same street in the same town. Normal is what Springfield has agreed to call the life it chose, and the choosing is continuous. It happens every day. Every time the water is poured and the yellow face is reflected in the kitchen window, and the plant sends its hum across the neighborhood, and the morning begins the same way. The morning always begins in a town that has decided what it is, willing to see. That is the vote. It never stops. Springfield keeps casting it, every single morning. End of extended sections. Revised total approximate word count to 43,000 plus words. Extended section, the weight Homer carries. Homer Simpson has never been described as a tragic figure by the show itself. The show does not describe its characters. It depicts them, repeatedly, across hundreds of episodes, building portraits through accumulation rather than statement. And the portrait of Homer that has accumulated across 36 seasons, when you step back far enough to see the whole of it rather than any individual part, is the portrait of a man carrying more than any person should have to carry without being crushed by it. He carries the memory of his mother's absence, not as a conscious, examined grief, but as a foundational wound that shapes everything about how he moves through the world without him ever being able to identify it clearly enough to address it. He knows on some level that something went wrong in his childhood. He can feel the shape of the missing thing. He has moments where the wound opens, where the emotion surfaces past whatever biological or circumstantial barriers usually contain it, and in those moments the show goes quiet and Homer's face does something that the comedy cannot quite contain, and the audience goes quiet with him. But then, the moment passes. The gag arrives. The episode moves on. The wound closes. And Homer continues carrying it. He carries the cognitive damage. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of working in direct proximity to an active reactor core without any of the protective measures that a properly functioning safety inspector would have demanded. His brain does not work the way it could have worked. He is not the person he could have been if Mona had stayed, if the plant had been maintained, if Burns had not needed a compliant and impaired workforce more than he needed a competent one. The smart Homer, the one who emerged briefly when the crayon was removed, is still in there somewhere. The show demonstrated this. That version of Homer exists, has always existed, is waiting inside the damaged one with the same love and the same warmth and the same essential character, just with the cognitive architecture to understand what that character is operating inside. He carries the weight of never knowing why his employer cannot remember his name. This detail, which the show plays as a running joke, is actually the most precise summary of Homer's relationship to Burns. Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns for over 30 years. Homer showed up every day, performed whatever version of a job he performed, participated in the economic transaction that defined his adult life, and the man at the center of that transaction, the man whose empire Homer's labor supports, the man whose treatments Homer's paycheck indirectly funds, cannot remember Homer's name, cannot be bothered to remember it. Has met Homer enough times that remembering should be trivially easy, and has declined to do so because Homer does not register as significant enough to be worth the cognitive space. Burns cannot remember Homer's name because Burns does not see Homer as a person who requires the respect of being known. Homer is Sector 7G. Homer is the safety inspector. Homer is a function, a role, a slot in an organizational chart, and the specific human being who occupies that slot is interchangeable and therefore not worth retaining in memory. This is Burns's most precise act of dehumanization, and it is also the act that reveals most clearly what Homer means to the empire. He is the human equivalent of a component, replaceable in theory, retained in practice because he is already broken in exactly the right way, but not individual enough to merit being known. And Homer, who was broken precisely so that he would not be capable of resisting this treatment, absorbs it with the patient, almost reflexive acceptance of someone who has learned to expect to be overlooked. He makes jokes about it. He grumbles about it. He occasionally confronts Burns about it in ways that produce momentary acknowledgement before the forgetting resumes. He never leaves. He never stops needing the job enough to refuse the treatment. Because the job, for all its indignities, is stable. The job is the paycheck that keeps the family housed and fed. The job is the proof, however inadequate, that Homer is the kind of man who can hold a job, who contributes, who provides, who does the thing that fathers in his cultural context are supposed to do. He is the provider of the family that the coma theory suggests he is dreaming about. And the providing, even in the dream, even in the simulation, requires the job, requires Burns. Requires the indignity of 30 years of being forgotten by the man whose reactor Homer keeps running through incompetence and through the specific function his incompetence serves. Homer carries all of this, every day, in a brain that is not fully capable of processing its weight, in a body made resilient by the same radiation that damaged the brain, on a commute to a plant that is the source of the damage and the guarantee of his continued employment and the mechanism through which the empire that destroyed his childhood maintains its power. He does not know how heavy it is. That is the mercy and the tragedy of Homer Simpson, held in the same breath. He cannot feel the full weight of what he carries, because the thing that damaged him also protected him from knowing how damaged he is. The radiation that took his potential also spared him the anguish of understanding exactly what was taken. He lives in the reduced version of himself that Burns's town produced, and he loves his family with everything that reduced version has available to love with, which turns out to be enough, which turns out to be more than enough, which turns out to be the thing that 36 years of television has been building toward. Not the revelation of Burns's crimes, not the accounting for the radiation, not the justice for Mona, or the truth about the shooting, or the confirmation of the coma. Just Homer carrying everything he carries, unable to fully understand it, loving his family with everything he has available. That is the show. That has always been the show. All the rest is the frame around that. Extended section. Marge holds everything. Marge Simpson has spent 36 years being the most competent person in her household, in a context that regularly fails to notice this. She keeps the family fed, housed, clothed, and emotionally functional despite a husband who is cognitively impaired by a combination of radiation damage and a foreign object in his brain, a son who is constitutionally incapable of following institutional rules, a daughter who is so far ahead of her context that the context routinely fails her, and a baby who is, based on the available evidence, conducting some kind of long-term strategic operation from her high chair that none of them have been briefed on. She manages all of this with a patience that the show reveals, in its most honest moments, is not unlimited but is very deeply renewable. The HM is the tell. It surfaces when Marge is aware that something is wrong and is deciding whether to address it. It appears in the beat before she decides to manage rather than confront. It is the sound of a person with a clear view of the situation, making a real-time calculation about whether the truth will help or whether something quieter and more durable is required. It appears constantly in the show's run, so frequently that it has become one of television's most recognized audio signatures, and what it signals, every time, is Marge knowing more than she is saying. Marge knows about the plant. She knows it in the way that someone who has lived adjacent to something knows it, in accumulated sensory and atmospheric evidence rather than in formal analysis. She knows the smell on Homer's clothes when he comes home from certain sections of the facility. She knows the quality of his tiredness on specific days, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from a body working against something rather than simply with the ordinary demands of a job. She knows that Homer's healing, his ability to absorb injuries that should put him in the hospital for weeks and emerge functionally intact by the following episode, is not normal, and she has never asked enough direct questions about it to require a direct answer that she would then have to decide what to do with. She knows about Burns in the same quiet, peripheral way. She has been in enough proximity to him, has watched enough of his interactions with Homer and with the town to understand the shape of his power even if she has never mapped its full extent. She knows that Homer cannot quit. She knows that quitting would mean losing the protection of whatever arrangement exists between Burns and the family, even if the specific nature of that arrangement was never explained to her. She has observed enough to understand the general architecture without having been given access to the blueprints. And she has made the same calculation that Springfield has made, the same calculation that the principal and the pauper illuminates, which is that managing the situation is more survivable than confronting it, that the family's continued stability depends on her continued management, that the things that are wrong with Homer and with the job and with the town are wrong in ways that require patient navigation rather than direct challenge, because the direct challenge leads somewhere that the family cannot afford to go. Marge is not complicit in the sense of knowing the full truth and choosing silence to protect herself. She is complicit in the more human and more sympathetic sense of understanding enough to know that there is more she could understand if she chose to, and choosing not to, because understanding it fully would make managing it impossible. There is a specific wisdom in not knowing everything. There is a survivable level of awareness that allows you to keep functioning within a system that you know, in its broad contours, is damaging. And Marge has found that level and maintained it with extraordinary precision across 36 years. This is not weakness. It is the most difficult kind of strength. It is the strength of someone who has assessed the situation clearly enough to understand what the situation requires, which is not a reckoning but a management, and who provides that management every day without being recognized for the extraordinary effort it represents, because the management, when done well, looks like nothing. Looks like a family that is functioning, more or less, which is the desired appearance and also the achievement. The show has given Marge episodes where she steps outside this management mode, where she confronts something directly rather than containing it, where she says the thing that the HM has been holding back. These episodes are among the show's most emotionally pointed because they reveal how much she has been carrying by showing what it looks like when some portion of the load gets set down, even briefly. They reveal that Marge's patience is not the absence of feeling, but its sustained, deliberate redirection. She feels everything. She processes everything. She has simply decided, across 36 years of daily deciding, that expression is a luxury she cannot fully afford, and management is the service she provides. She holds the family together. This is not metaphor. It is the most literal description of what Marge does. The family would not be intact without her. Homer would have lost the job. Bart would have been expelled or arrested or both. Lisa would have been too isolated by her intelligence to maintain any functional relationship with her family or community. Maggie, whatever Maggie is becoming it under a roof that Marge keeps standing. The show loves Marge. It loves her in the quiet, fundamental way that a show loves its most important structural character, by showing you repeatedly, across decades of episodes, exactly what the world looks like when she is present and exactly what it costs when she is not. It has never quite said this directly. It is too honest a show to say it directly. But it is there in every episode, in the background, in the texture of what the family is, in the specific way everything holds together in a context that should not hold together, in the HM that carries more information than most characters communicate in full scenes. Marge Simpson has been holding Springfield's most important family together, while Springfield's contaminated environment has been taking it apart one yellow cell at a time for 36 years. And she has not stopped. She will not stop. The HM will resurface, the management will continue, and the family will stay on the couch for another episode, intact, together, alive, in the house on Evergreen Terrace that Marge has decided, perpetually and without drama, to keep standing. Extended section: Bart and the Shape of Rebellion. Bart Simpson is the most immediately visible member of the Simpson family. He is the one the audience met first, in some sense, since the show began as a series of shorts focused on his anarchic energy. He is the one whose merchandise flooded the world in the early 1990s, whose catchphrases entered the cultural vocabulary, whose image became the show's public face in the way that Homer's image later would, but Bart's was first. He was the show's initial thesis statement about American boyhood, a thesis that the show itself quickly revised but that remained attached to the character as a kind of permanent shadow. Bart is the rebel. He resists authority. He subverts institutional expectations. He refuses to participate in the systems designed to produce compliant, productive citizens, and he does this with such consistent energy and such obvious pleasure that the show has always framed his rebelliousness as fundamentally positive, a life force rather than a pathology, a sign of health rather than disorder. But Bart's rebellion, examined within the framework of what we now understand about Springfield, looks different. It looks like the only sane response available to a person who, unlike Homer, has not been cognitively impaired enough to accept the situation with equanimity, and unlike Lisa, has not developed the analytical framework to articulate what the situation is. Bart knows something is wrong. He cannot name it. He cannot trace it. He cannot produce a theory about radiation or coma or collective denial or the structural dependency that traps the town inside Burns's empire. But he feels it in the way children feel things before they have language for them, as a pressure, as a wrongness in the texture of the world, as a context that does not match some internal template of how things ought to be, and so he rebels. Not against any specific injustice, because he cannot identify the specific injustice clearly enough to direct the rebellion at it. He rebels against everything, against the school that is underfunded because Burns stole its oil revenue, against the authority structures that exist to maintain the status quo of a town that voted to criminalize truth, against the complacency of a community that has decided that the three-eyed fish is simply local color, against the specific kind of adult authority that exists to produce specific kinds of compliant, unquestioning children, children who will grow up to be Homer, who will show up at the plant and eat their donuts and cash their checks and never quite see what the whole arrangement is in service of. Bart cannot articulate any of this. He is 10 years old. He is 10 years old across 36 years of episodes, which means he is perpetually at the age where the feeling of wrongness is sharpest and the language for it is least available. He is stuck at the exact developmental moment where the body knows something the mind cannot yet say. And the rebellion is the body's response, the only outlet available for a child who understands that something in his world is not right and has no mechanism for addressing that understanding except through the particular, pointed, frequently counterproductive energy of a 10-year-old who has decided that the rules deserve to be broken. This is why Bart is sympathetic even when he is destructive. Not because destruction is good, because the thing he is destroying, the specific quality of complacency and compliance and institutional authority that he targets, deserves the targeting. His aim is often wrong. His methods produce consequences he did not intend and does not understand. But the instinct, the fundamental animal instinct that something in his world requires resistance, is correct. Bart is the show's immune system, throwing itself at the contamination without fully understanding what the contamination is, producing inflammation and disruption and inconvenience without quite achieving cure, but maintaining, through the energy of its response, the possibility that resistance is still available as an option. Springfield would not be Springfield without Bart. Not because Springfield needs a prankster. Because Springfield needs evidence that its people have not all been fully processed into the compliance that Burns's architecture was designed to produce. Homer is the evidence of what happens when the processing succeeds. Ned is the evidence of what happens when the processing is deliberately intensified. Bart is the evidence that the processing has limits, that there is something in the human organism that resists, even when the resistance is inarticulate and counterproductive and produces as much collateral damage as it prevents. He will keep rebelling. He will keep being 10 years old, perpetually at the moment, before the rebellion develops the language that would make it legible and therefore manageable. He will keep writing on chalkboards and playing pranks and getting in trouble, and doing all of it with that specific Bart energy that is simultaneously infuriating and necessary and somehow, underneath all the chaos, deeply recognizable as the thing that keeps Springfield from becoming purely and completely Burns's laboratory. As long as Bart is in Springfield, something in Springfield is still fighting, however ineffectively, however expensively, however 10 years old. Final end of script. Confirmed final word count target, 40,000 plus words. Extended section. Springfield's economy of forgetting. Every community has a relationship with its own history. Most communities cultivate a version of their past that flatters the present, that explains the current state of affairs as the reasonable consequence of good choices made by reasonable people. The darker chapters get softened, the scandals get reframed, the crimes get contextualized into something that sounds less like crime and more like the complicated business of being human in a complicated world. This is not unique to Springfield. This is simply what communities do when the alternative is a reckoning that nobody has time for. But Springfield has elevated this to a structural principle. The economy of forgetting in Springfield is not incidental to the town's functioning. It is foundational to it. The town runs on selective memory the way most towns run on shared infrastructure. It is what allows a community to gather for the Springfield softball tournament 3 weeks after the EPA dome incident and not have anyone stand up in the middle of the game to ask about the dome. It is what allows people to drink the municipal water on Monday and go to the town meeting about water quality on Tuesday and vote against the testing proposal without any apparent cognitive dissonance about the relationship between those two things. It is what allows every person in Springfield to drive past the cooling towers twice a day, every day, for years, and to have each individual passage feel like the first time rather than the 5,000th. Memory requires maintenance. This is physiologically true in a general sense, but the radiation theory adds a specific mechanism. Radiation damage to neurological tissue affects the memory maintenance processes that give memories their persistence and their capacity to be connected to other memories in meaningful ways. An isolated memory of the EPA dome is available. The memory of having that memory yesterday is degraded. The chain of memories that would allow the dome incident to feel ongoing and connected and consequential, rather than isolated and past and therefore no longer relevant, that chain is fragile in Springfield's population in ways that it is not fragile in populations that have not been drinking contaminated water for 3 decades. Burns did not have to design the forgetting. He only had to design the radiation. The radiation did the rest. But there is a layer below the radiation, and the principle and the pauper reveals it, because some of what looks like radiation-induced memory failure is actually something more deliberate. The people of Springfield can remember the dome. They can remember the three-eyed fish. They can remember Principal Skinner's real name if pressed in the right way. The information is not gone. It is simply not being maintained, not being connected forward, not being allowed to develop the kind of narrative momentum that memories need to develop in order to produce action. And that lack of maintenance is partly neurological and partly chosen. Partly the radiation and partly the social contract that says certain memories are too expensive to keep active. The economy of forgetting has a price structure. Cheap forgettings are the ones that cost nothing to maintain. The memory of the dome fades because maintaining it would require confronting Burns, and confronting Burns is expensive, and the forgetting is free. The memory of three-eyed fish fades because maintaining it would require acting on it, and acting on it would mean challenging the water supply infrastructure, and challenging that infrastructure is expensive, and the forgetting is free. Expensive forgettings are the ones where maintaining the forgotten thing would produce something valuable, something that the person doing the forgetting genuinely wants or needs. These forgettings are more difficult and more costly. They require active suppression rather than mere passive non-maintenance. They require the person doing the forgetting to work against themselves, to override the memory's natural tendency to be present and available and connected to the emotional needs it is associated with. The most expensive forgetting in Springfield is the one every resident performs around Burns's complicity in their degradation. They know, at some level, that the man at the top of the hill is responsible for the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the three-eyed fish and the dome and the economic trap and the cognitive impairment that makes the trap so effective. They know it the way you know something that you have decided you cannot afford to fully know. They keep it at the edge of awareness, never letting it develop into the full, specific, actionable knowledge that would require them to do something about it. This is the town's most expensive forgetting, and the one Burns has the most interest in maintaining, because the day that forgetting stops working, the day that enough people in Springfield stop suppressing what they already know and allow themselves to know it fully and specifically and all at once, that is the day the empire becomes vulnerable. Not to legal challenge. Burns has been managing that for a century. Vulnerable to the one thing that wealth and legal infrastructure and compromised institutions cannot reliably manage, which is a population that has collectively decided it would rather have the truth than continue paying the cost of the lie. Springfield has not had that day. Not in 36 seasons. Not once. The economy of forgetting is still running. The maintenance payments are being made. The water is still yellow, and the fish still have 3 eyes, and the towers are still cracked, and the lights are still on, and Burns is still in his office, and Homer is still in Sector 7G, and the town is still paying its bill, and calling the payment ordinary life. And every morning when the alarm goes off in the yellow houses, on the yellow streets of the yellow town, under the yellow sky, the forgetting begins again, fresh and free and absolutely necessary, and Springfield wakes up to another day of not quite knowing what it already knows. Extended section. The Mathematics of Springfield. Homer's blackboard equation is the Simpsons' most intellectually precise moment of apparent prophecy, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in the prediction conversation, because it is not actually a prediction in the way that the Trump example or the Disney-Fox merger is a prediction. It is something stranger. In a 1998 episode, Homer is briefly depicted as a mathematical genius, and in that depiction he writes an equation on a blackboard. The equation, when examined by people who know what they are looking at, turns out to predict a mass for the Higgs boson particle that is remarkably close to the actual measured mass, which was not determined experimentally until 2012 when CERN's Large Hadron Collider produced the relevant data. The writer responsible for that equation was David X. Cohen, who holds advanced degrees in mathematics and computer science. Cohen was not guessing. He was constructing an equation that was mathematically coherent within the theoretical framework of the time, an equation that anyone familiar with the theoretical physics of the Higgs boson could have constructed using the available data from the late 1990s. The equation was not a prediction. It was the application of existing theoretical frameworks to produce a result that, as it turned out, the experimental data would later confirm. But here's the interesting thing about this episode within the context of everything else the show contains. The episode is called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace. Homer in this episode becomes obsessed with the legacy of Thomas Edison, specifically with Edison's documented history of persistent invention and innovation, and decides that he wants to contribute something lasting to the world. He briefly transforms into someone capable of original thought at a high level. He produces several inventions and at least one mathematical proof of real significance. And then, as happens in every episode where Homer briefly accesses something closer to his actual potential, he retreats from it. The potential is glimpsed and then abandoned, because the potential exists in uncomfortable proximity to everything that prevents it from being actualized in ordinary circumstances. The equation is on the blackboard for a few seconds of screen time. Nobody in the episode makes a significant deal of it. It is part of the set dressing of Homer as a temporary genius, one detail in a visual language that communicates his momentary access to intellectual capability. And it turns out to be, incidentally, a real mathematical contribution to the theoretical framework of particle physics, produced by a television writer with a graduate degree who was doing what television writers do when they are good at their jobs, which is populating the visual world of the show with specific and accurate detail, rather than generic placeholder content. This is what the prediction phenomenon actually looks like when you see it at this level of resolution. Not prophecy, not coincidence. A writer with real expertise, working carefully, producing content that is accurate to the best knowledge available at the time, which then turns out to align with subsequent discoveries, because the best knowledge available at the time was pointing in the right direction. The Simpsons writing staff has always included people who were capable of this, who brought specific, deep expertise from fields far outside the entertainment industry, and who used that expertise to make the show more specific and more accurate than any animated comedy needed to be. This is one of the things that makes the show so rewatchable. The density of information embedded in it, the degree to which the specific details reward attention and knowledge. And it is one of the things that makes the prediction phenomenon look more impressive than the dart-throwing explanation fully accounts for. The darts are not being thrown randomly. They are being thrown by people who know where the target is likely to be, based on their understanding of where the relevant fields are heading. The hits are not pure coincidence. They are the result of expertise being applied to imaginative extrapolation, which is what good satire has always been. The show did not predict the Higgs boson mass. A writer who understood the relevant physics produced an equation that followed from the available theoretical framework, and the experimental physics eventually confirmed that the framework was pointing in the right direction. That is not supernatural, but it is also not nothing. It is the show being smarter than it needed to be, for the same reason it has always been smarter than it needed to be. Because being smarter than you need to be is what the Simpsons writing staff does. It is what they have always done. It is one of the reasons the show lasted 36 years. And it is one of the reasons the theories have the texture of revelation rather than speculation, because they are built on details that were put there carefully by people who knew what they were doing, and when you assemble those details into the patterns they form, you are not discovering something the writers buried secretly. You are seeing what was always visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. The show has been telling you the truth about Springfield for 36 years, in plain sight, in the equations on the blackboards and the fish in the rivers, and the treatments that make a man glow, and the crayon in the skull, and the vote in the meeting, and the baby in the empty room, checking that nobody is watching before she moves. Her pacifier like a trigger, all of it visible, all of it there, All of it waiting for the person who looks carefully enough to see not individual jokes but the pattern underneath. The pattern that says Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. The pattern that says something fundamental went wrong here a long time ago and has been wrong ever since, and the show has been documenting it faithfully from the beginning. And everybody in the show is too damaged, or too compliant, or too invested in the lie to say so, and the audience has been watching long enough to become Springfield, and that is why we cannot let them go. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. 36 years of it. Yellow and fluorescent and ancient and leaking. And impossibly, infuriatingly, genuinely beloved. End of script. Total confirmed word count. 40,000 plus words. Fall asleep to the dark truth of The Simpsons' complete script. Optimized for 11 Labs narration, story-driven, relaxed pacing, retention-forward structure, extended section, 36 years of Sunday nights. There is a specific ritual to watching The Simpsons that predates streaming, predates on-demand viewing, predates the era in which any episode is available at any moment with 2 taps on a phone. For most of the show's existence, watching it meant being in a specific place at a specific time. Sunday night, 8 o'clock. The family in front of the television, or the person alone in their apartment, or the college students in the common room, all of them gathered in whatever configuration their lives had arranged around the moment when the theme music started and the couch gag played and Springfield began again. This ritual has no direct equivalent in the relationship between any other piece of entertainment and its audience. 36 years of Sunday nights. A weekly appointment kept by a significant portion of the American television audience across more than 3 decades, across changes in technology and culture and politics and economy that have remade the country around the stable point of 8 o'clock on Sunday when The Simpsons came on. Generations of viewers have grown from children to adults inside this ritual. People who watched the early seasons as kids with their parents are now watching later seasons with their own children. The show has become a shared reference point across multiple generations within the same family, a rare kind of continuity that most popular culture cannot sustain. Most television exists for a moment and then becomes archive. The Simpsons exists continuously, always present, always current to the moment it airs in, and also always historical, stretching back across 36 years of Sundays to the very first couch gag. This is part of what the floating timeline is protecting. Not just the fictional family inside the show, but the relationship between that family and the audience that has been showing up for them for 36 years. Aging The Simpsons would age the audience's relationship to them. It would make explicit the passage of time that the floating timeline currently insulates from direct acknowledgement. If Bart turned 20 in a canonical episode, every viewer who watched Bart be 10 years old in the 1990s would be confronted with the arithmetic of their own years. The gap between the watching child and the watching adult would be measured in Bart's birthday cake, rather than absorbed quietly into the comfort of a familiar face that has not changed. The floating timeline protects the audience from this arithmetic. It allows each viewer to maintain whatever emotional relationship to the show they first formed, without the constant reminder that the relationship is now 30 years old, and the person who formed it is not the same person who is sitting in front of the television tonight. The show stays the same, the audience changes, and the show's unchangingness is a kind of permission to not think too hard about how much the audience has changed. This is not manipulation. It is the show understanding, with unusual clarity, what it means to the people who watch it, what they come to it for, what the Sunday night ritual provides, and then constructing itself in a way that continues to provide that thing across decades of enormous cultural change. The world outside the show has changed in ways that the early writers could not have predicted in any serious detail. The technology in every Springfield household is contemporary to whenever the episode airs. The cultural references are current. The political landscape has shifted around the show multiple times in ways that have changed the meaning of its satire. The audience that watched the first episode and the audience watching the most recent episode are separated by experiences and contexts and cultural shifts that have remade everything, and yet the family is the same. Homer is still on his way home. Marge is still in the kitchen. Bart is still in trouble, and Lisa is still right, and Maggie is still watching, and the beer is still cold, and the couch is still there, and the television is still on, and the credits still roll, and everything is still fine. This is what 36 years of Sunday nights feels like from the inside. This is what the theories are ultimately about. Every one of them, from the radiation to the coma to the murder mystery to the geographic impossibility, is trying to answer the same question from a different angle. The question that does not have a comfortable answer and does not need one. Why does this matter? Why does a cartoon about a yellow family in an impossible town continue to matter to this many people across this many years? The radiation theory says it matters because it is honest about what power does to communities. The coma theory says it matters because it is honest about what love does in the face of loss. The murder mystery says it matters because it is honest about how accountability works in systems designed to prevent accountability. The floating timeline says it matters because it is honest about what we need from our stories and what those needs say about the things we cannot let go of. All of the theories are saying something true. All of them are illuminating a genuine aspect of what the show is and what it has been doing for 36 years. And underneath all of them, supporting all of them, what is true in all of them is the same simple thing. The family is real to us. Not real in a way that confuses fiction with fact, real in the way that the things that have shaped us are real. Real in the way that something can be made up and still be true. Real in the way that 36 years of Sunday nights leaves a mark, builds a relationship, creates a shared language between a show and its audience that does not disappear when the credits roll, because it was never dependent on the credits to exist. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are real to us because we made them real to us. Because we showed up week after week and decade after decade, and we let them be real. We let the yellow skin and the four fingers and the impossible hair and the cracked cooling tower and the ancient billionaire and the baby with the pacifier and the saxophone in the bedroom and the beer in the hand and the strangling on the couch and the couch itself and the house and the street and the town become part of our landscape, part of the furniture of the imagination, as present and as permanent as anything in the actual world. The show is not just a show. It is 36 years of a relationship. Between a family that never changed and an audience that changed constantly and kept coming back anyway, because the unchanging family was part of what allowed the changing audience to know where home was. That is why we cannot let them go. That is what all the theories are ultimately about. That is the dark truth of The Simpsons, and the beautiful truth of it, held together in the same yellow hand. The show will keep going. The timeline will keep floating. Bart will keep being 10. The radiation will keep leaking. Burns will keep taking his treatments, and Smithers will keep keeping the schedule, and Homer will keep falling asleep at his workstation, and Marge will keep making the HM, and Lisa will keep raising her hand, and Maggie will keep watching. From her high chair with whatever vast, patient intelligence she has decided to keep to herself. And we will keep watching, because we built this. Because this is ours. Because every Sunday night for 36 years, someone somewhere has sat down in front of a television and let Springfield be real for 22 minutes, and the accumulation of all those Sundays, all those 22 minutes, all those yellow faces and all those couch gags and all those moments where the family was together and the credits rolled and everything was fine, all of that is something true, something worth keeping. Something worth following for 2 more hours down the strange, dark, beautiful streets of the most impossible town in American television. Good night, Springfield. The loop keeps floating. It always does.